I'll definitely have some questions for you. Now, Ms. Norton.
Yeah, I'm a political theorist.
Please press the button in front of your microphone. Thank you.
A novelty. I'm a political theorist, and I hope you will excuse me if my focus is slightly different. I want to return to politics and to the political questions which seem to me to be at the forefront of certain aspects of American policy in the world after 9/11. Some of these are the rising executive power, the expanding tolerance of authoritarianism both at home and abroad, and the changing focus of American foreign and domestic policy. Central to this is the change in American conservatism. American conservatism once had a certain sort of fairly recognizable profile, a commitment to certain tenets. Conservatives reverenced custom and tradition. They distrusted abstract projects, grand theories. They advocated balanced budgets and small government, and they were frugal about government spending. They were cautious above all. This disposition and the political positions that expressed it have a very long history in the United States, but it has been radically altered in recent years. Neoconservatives are not conservative according to this traditional model, and they are, as they will tell you, as Tom DeLay once told me, they are revolutionaries. Neoconservatives have a rather different and rather disturbing profile. They want a strong state. A state that will put its strength to use, that allies itself and will empower corporations. They have an economic rhetoric that speaks to the concerns of small business, small property owners, and working people, but the benefits are given to wealthy individuals and corporations. They reject the vulgarity of mass culture. They deplore the decadence of artists and intellectuals. Although often not religious themselves, they ally themselves with religion and religious crusades. They encourage family values. For women, a return to children, cooking, and the church. They make a romance of war, arguing that war will restore manliness, private virtue, and public spirit. They favor the expansion of executive power. They admire authoritarian leaders abroad, especially, as you have already heard, Pakistan's Pervez Musharraf. And they argue that America itself would profit from a more authoritarian presidency and what they call a more disciplined democracy. A more disciplined democracy, as they define it, is one with more surveillance of the people, more secrecy in the government, and willingness to employ methods earlier conservatives and indeed earlier Americans rejected, the curtailment of civil rights and, of course, torture. Treating the 9/11 as an institutional problem has given them a license to expand executive power and to employ these previously prescribed methods. Neoconservative foreign policy centers on a fear of world government and the international institutions that might lead to it, most notably the United Nations, a rejection of multilateralism, and, as they say, above all, the ability to distinguish friends from enemies. Neoconservatives are wont to describe this particular ability to distinguish friends from enemies to Thucydides, but it belongs to Carl Schmitt, often called the crown jurist of the Third Reich. Schmitt regarded the distinction between friend and enemy as the foundation of politics. And along with this, he argued that sovereignty came not from the people, but from the decision, that is to say, the capacity of the executive, the ruler, to decide matters, and that arbitrary power was foundational for sovereignty. These ideas came to neoconservatism both directly from Carl Schmitt and through Leo Strauss, who has taught many of the most prominent neoconservatives in the present administration and indeed in neoconservative think tanks throughout the city and indeed throughout the country. Neoconservatives have employed this ideology as a rationale for the expansion of executive power. Europeans regard neoconservative with special skepticism, and they do so, as you might have already realized, because they know its progenitors all too well. The desire for the combination of traditional values, the desire for an expansion of executive power, the ambition to create a new world order, and the identification of a providential enemy are all parts of a very familiar past. The shadows of German National Socialism and 19th century European empires fall very heavily on the neoconservative project. As the administration responded to 9/11, this influence became increasingly evident. Before 9/11, neoconservatives saw America's military hegemony as an opportunity. As they argued, national security should no longer be concerned with defending against threats, rather it should be regarded as an opportunity, and that opportunity should be seized. In their words, America should seek to make trouble in the world. They call this robust internationalism, an avowedly expansionist foreign policy that aimed at establishing a new world order to rival Rome and to surpass the European colonial projects of the 19th century. This vision of America's role requires considerably more power in the executive branch, particularly stronger police powers, more military funding, more arms, more money, a larger executive bureaucracy. After 9/11, this was America's military hegemony, its sort of unipolar character, was cast not merely as an opportunity, but as a civilizational struggle. In his first term, George Bush incautiously but accurately referred to the global war on terror as a crusade. Casting what conservatives called the Pax Americana as a civilizational struggle identified what Carl Schmitt had called the providential enemy and clarified the policy focus on the Middle East. The providential enemy is not an ordinary enemy, Schmitt argued, not one simply to be defeated. The providential enemy had to be absolutely annihilated. The promise made after 9/11 to seek the annihilation of the terrorists was a dangerous and self-defeating promise. It declared a war without a clear enemy, with no clear strategic objectives, a war without limits. This did away with the traditional constraints on the conduct of war, from the just war theories of Augustine, Aquinas, and Al-Farabi to the Geneva Convention. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo have shown us the consequences that follow when these traditional restraints are removed. Neoconservative policy in the wake of 9/11 installed a new language, a new military, and a new anti-Semitism. The new language is one in which mercenaries are called civilian contractors and foreign fighters refer solely to those not allied with the United States. The new military relied heavily on private forces, these old mercenaries now called civilian contractors, who made more for the same activity that ordinary soldiers performed for little compensation. While soldiers raid junkyards to fashion hillbilly armor, corporations are making increasing amounts of money on these privatized contracts. The old phrase in American politics, a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, acquired a new salience. The burdens of the war were borne not by the nation as a whole, but disproportionately by a few, an inequity that reflects neoconservative conceptions of the proper distinction between the few and the many, the few who rule and the many whom the few are permitted to deceive. Moreover, it confirms Tocqueville's warnings about the dangers of a volunteer army and the importance of a draft as securing an army that in which the people as a whole bear the burdens of war. The response to 9/11 showed initially a commendable desire to avoid the immediate targeting of Muslims or Arabs. One could argue that despite the arrest of Brandon Mayfield, the detention and deportation of scores of American Muslims, the explicit rhetorical targeting of Arabs and Muslims has been largely avoided. Neoconservative foreign policy, however, has been driven by a new form of anti-Semitism. At the end of the 19th century, it was the Jewish anarchist and the Jewish communist who were portrayed as agents of global terror. Now it is Muslims who are involved in shadowy global conspiracies, Muslims who have fellow travelers. The old language of anti-Semitism has found a new target. We have licensed this anti-Semitism at home and funded it abroad on condition that it take the Arab and the Muslim rather than the Jew as its target. This has produced discrimination against Arabs and Muslims in the United States, indifference to the growth of democracy in Palestine, and a counterproductive policy of regime change in the Middle East. The targeting of Muslims as a providential enemy is evident throughout the 9/11 Commission report. I think the most glaring example is near the conclusion on page 362. Here, here Islam in general is identified as the enemy because of its inability to distinguish between religion and politics, a curious standard and one which American politics, in even its most secular form, would not satisfy. This kind of providentialism has led to a misdirection of American military action, and it has continued political failure. The blanket condemnation of Islam hampers the ability to identify true terrorist threats. And throughout the report, it encourages a focus on institutional failure, sort of bureaucratic tidiness, rather than attention to political context. One of the most remarkable features of the 9/11 Commission report is its utter indifference to politics or to history. There's, in the whole report, probably a total of 3 pages on political context, an extraordinary void. One would think that this were an act of God or change in the weather, and not a political act in a political context with a long, complex, but indeed widely known and widely studied history. This neoconservative policy in the wake of 9/11, and more immediately in the wake of the attacks in London and the continuing news from Iraq, obliges us to conclude that neoconservative foreign policy has failed to spread democracy or to diminish terror. It has succeeded rather well, however, at diminishing democracy at home while failing to extend it abroad. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we proceed with my introduction of Peter Dale Scott, Dr. Scott, I'd like to ask if we have a copy of the testimony of all of the panelists on this panel. Do we? Yes. Do we have yours?
I can give
Very good. Thank you. Dr. Scott is Professor Emeritus of English at the University of California, Berkeley. He is author of Drugs, Oil, and War, and 7 other books, including Deep Politics and the Death of JFK and the Iran-Contra Connection. He has also published award-winning poetry. Both his prose and poetry deal, among other matters, with U.S. covert operations, their impact on democracy at home and abroad, their relations to the John F. Kennedy assassination, and their relations to the global drug traffic. Dr. Scott holds degrees from McGill University, his city of birth. Prior to having taught for 34 years at UC Berkeley, Scott was a Canadian diplomat and served at the United Nations and the Canadian Embassy in Poland. Dr. Scott.
The American people have been seriously misled about the origins of Al-Qaeda, a movement blamed for the 9/11 attacks, just as they have been seriously misled about the reasons for America's invasion of Iraq. The truth is that for at least 2 decades, the United States has engaged in energetic programs to secure U.S. control over the Persian Gulf and also to open up Central Asia for development by U.S. oil companies. Americans were eager to gain access to the petroleum reserves of the Caspian Basin, which at that time were still estimated to be the largest known reserves of unexploited fuel in the planet. To this end, time after time, U.S. covert operations in the region have used so-called Arab-Afghan warriors as assets, the jihadis whom we loosely link with the name and leadership of Al-Qaeda. In country after country, these Arab Afghans have been involved in trafficking Afghan heroin. America's sponsorship of drug-trafficking Muslim warriors, including those now in Al-Qaeda, dates back to the Afghan War of 1979-89, sponsored in part by the CIA's links to the drug laundering Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. It was part of CIA Director Casey's strategy for launching covert operations over and above those approved and financed by a democratically controlled Congress. The most conspicuous example of this alliance with drug traffickers in the 1980s was the Contra support operation. Here again, foreign money and drug profits filled the gap after Congress denied funds through the so-called Boland amendments. In this case, government funds were also used to lie about the Contras to the American people. And I will add, apropos of this morning, that there was also a massive cover-up, including a cover-up of people, some of them convicted, who are now in the present administration. And my book, Covert Politics, talks about the role of Lee Hamilton in that cover-up. The lying continues. The 9/11 Commission report assures Americans that, quote, bin Laden and his comrades had their own sources of support and training, and they received little or no assistance from the United States, close quote. This misleading statement fails to consider that, 1, al-Qaeda elements received considerable indirect U.S. government assistance, first in Afghanistan till 92, and thereafter in other countries such as Azerbaijan, 92 to 95, and Kosovo, 1998. Before 1992, for example, the Afghan leader Jalaluddin Haqqani organized and hosted the Arab-Afghan volunteers known later as al-Qaeda, and in turn, Haqqani, quote, received bags of money each month from the CIA station in Islamabad, close quote. The Arab Afghans were also trained in urban terrorism, including car bombings by Pakistani ISI operatives who in turn were trained by the CIA. 2. Key members of the network, which became al-Qaeda, such as Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, Ali Mohammed, Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, and perhaps Ayman al-Zawahiri, were granted visas to enter the United States, despite being suspected of terrorism and, in some cases, on State Department watch lists. Al-Qaeda foot soldiers were also admitted to the United States for training under a special visa program. 3. An al-Qaeda operative at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, an al-Qaeda operative was given a list of Muslim candidates for al-Qaeda's jihad. 4. When al-Qaeda personnel were trained in the United States by a key al-Qaeda operative, Sergeant Ali Mohammed of the U.S. Army Special Forces, Mohammed was still on the U.S. Army payroll. 5. As we know, there was FBI protection of al-Qaeda terrorists from investigation and prosecution, the case of Moussaoui that we heard about this morning being just one. In part, America's limited covert assistance to al-Qaeda after 1989 was in order not to offend al-Qaeda's primary supporters, which America needed as allies, the intelligence networks of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. But unquestionably, the entry of United States oil companies into oil-rich Azerbaijan was achieved with the assistance of a U.S.-organized covert program using Arab-Afghan operatives associated with bin Laden. Oil was the driving force of U.S. involvement in Central and South Asia, and oil led to U.S. coexistence with both al-Qaeda and the world-dominating Afghan heroin trade. This brings us to another extraordinary distortion in the 9/11 report. While the drug trade was a source of income for the Taliban, it did not serve the same purpose for al-Qaeda. Now, that drug trafficking does support al-Qaeda-connected operations has been energetically asserted by the governments of Great Britain and many other European countries, as well as the head of the U.S. Congressional Task Force on Terrorism. Heroin trafficking has been a source of income, in particular, for al-Qaeda-related warriors in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Chechnya, and Kosovo. Most recently, it has supported terrorist attacks in the Netherlands and Spain. U.S. support for al-Qaeda elements, particularly in Azerbaijan and Kosovo, has increased dramatically the flow of drugs to the West and also to this country. In the former Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, Arab Afghans clearly assisted the effort of U.S. oil companies to penetrate the region. In 1992, Richard Secord, Heine Aderholt, and Ed Dearborn, three veterans of U.S. operations in Laos and then Iran-Contra, turned up in Baku under the cover of an oil company, Mega Oil. Now, Mega never did find oil, but it did contribute materially to the removal of Azerbaijan from the sphere of post-Soviet Russian influence. As mega operatives in Azerbaijan, Secord, Aderholt, and Dearborn and their men engaged in military training. They passed brown bags filled with cash to members of the government, and above all, set up an airline on the model of Air America, which was soon picking up hundreds of Mujahideen mercenaries in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Mujahideen leader Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in Afghanistan, who at the time was still allied with bin Laden, was, quote, observed recruiting Afghan mercenaries, that's say Arab Afghans, Al-Qaeda, to fight in Azerbaijan against Armenia and its Russian allies, close quote. In this period, Hekmatyar's heroin surged through Baku into Chechnya and Russia and North America. It is difficult to believe that Dearborn's airline, much like Air America, was not involved. The triple pattern of drugs, oil, and Al-Qaeda was seen again in Kosovo in 1998, where the Al-Qaeda-backed Islamist jihadis of the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, received overt American assistance from the U.S. government. Though unmentioned in mainstream books on the war, both the Al-Qaeda and the drug backgrounds of the KLA are recognized by experts and, to my knowledge, have never been contested by them. At the time, critics charged that U.S. oil interests were interested in building a trans-Balkan pipeline with U.S. Army protection. Although initially ridiculed, these critics were eventually proven correct. BBC News announced in December 2004 that a $1.2 billion pipeline south of a huge new U.S. Army base in Kosovo has been given a go-ahead by the governments of Albania, Bulgaria, and Macedonia. Meanwhile, by 2000, according to DEA statistics, Afghan heroin accounted for almost 20% of the heroin seized in the United States, nearly double the percentage taken 4 years earlier. Much of it is now distributed here by Kosovar Albanians. Now I'd like to talk a bit about Sergeant Ali Mohammed, and I'm only sorry I don't have enough time to do justice to this subject. The 9/11 report describes Ali Mohammed as, quote, a former Egyptian army officer who had moved to the United States in the mid-1980s, enlisted in the U.S. Army, and become an instructor at Fort Bragg, as well as helping to plan the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Kenya. In fact, Ali Mohammed was a very important Al-Qaeda agent who, as the 9/11 Commission was told, quote, trained most of the Al-Qaeda's top leadership, including persons who would later carry out the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, close quote. But the person telling the 9/11 Commission this, U.S. Attorney Patrick J. Fitzgerald, very much in the papers these days, misrepresented Ali Mohammed's FBI relationship. He told the Commission that, quote, from 1994 until his arrest in 1998, Mohammed lived as an American citizen in California, applying for jobs as an FBI translator and working as a security guard for a defense contractor. Now, Ali Mohammed was not just an FBI job applicant. Unquestionably, he was an FBI informant, and almost certainly he was something more than this. A veteran of the CIA-trained bodyguards of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, He was able, despite being on a State Department watch list, to come to America around 1984 on what an FBI consultant has called, quote, a visa program controlled by the CIA, close quote, and to obtain a job, first as a security officer, then with U.S. Special Forces. In 1998, he took a lengthy leave of absence from the U.S. Army and went to fight in Afghanistan, totally against U.S. Army regulations. And there he met with Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was later bin Laden's chief deputy in al-Qaeda, and the rest of the Arab-Afghan leadership. Despite this breach of regulations, he was able to receive an honorable discharge 1 year later, at which point he established close contact with bin Laden in Afghanistan. Now, Ali Mohammed clearly enjoyed U.S. protection. In 1993, he was detained by the RCMP in Canada, and a single phone call to the United States secured his release. This enabled him to play a role in the same year in planning the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Kenya in 1998. Now, eventually, he was allowed to plea bargain and receive a secret sentence. We don't know what the sentence is, still not known as late as 1991, where he's continuing to talk to the press. The amazing thing, although that he was named as a conspirator in that bombing, he was not an indicted conspirator, which itself is evidence of something going on behind the scene. Congress should determine the true relationship of the U.S. government to Ali Mohammed, who was close to bin Laden and above all Zawahiri, who has been called the main player in 9/11. This is very important, I think, that whereas the report focuses almost uniquely on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi bin al-Shibh, many other sources independently say the main figure and the top brains in al-Qaeda was al-Zawahiri, who Ali Mohammed was clearly close to. I didn't put it in my remarks, but he brought Zawahiri twice to this country to raise funds, ostensibly for charities, but were funds that were used, in fact, for covert operations. So this was our U.S. insight into the top level of the Arab Afghans and of al-Qaeda. In particular, Congress should determine why Patrick Fitzgerald chose to mislead the American people about Mohammed's FBI status. In short, the al-Qaeda terror network accused of the 9/11 attacks was supported and expanded by U.S. programs and covert operations, both during and, most importantly, after the Soviet-Afghan War. So Congress should rethink their decision to grant still greater powers and budget to the agencies responsible for fostering this enemy in the first place. Sane voices clamor from the Muslim world that the best answer to terrorism is not war, but justice. We should listen to them. By using its energies to reduce the injustices tormenting Islam, the United States will do more to diminish terrorism than by creating any number of new directorates in Washington. Thank you.
This is absolutely riveting testimony. Absolutely riveting. Thank you. Nafis?
Thank you. I'm very glad, actually, that, Peter, you brought up this kind of information, because this is kind of the core of my new research. And that's what I'll be discussing. I'll be discussing some of these issues of what's been happening in the post-Cold War period. So an accurate understanding of the history of US relations with the Afghan Mujahideen is essential to understand international terrorism today. So what I'm going to try and do is attempt to condense this history very, very briefly to capture some of its most striking and significant features. And in doing so, I'm going to hope to demonstrate as fact a hypothesis that flies entirely in the face of the official narrative, that US relations with the Mujahideen selectively did not end with the Cold War, but on the contrary, have continued in many odd ways to this day in the post-Cold War era. and that this subtle hidden relationship contributes quite directly to the systematic undermining of national security through the inadvertent cultivation of the sources of international terrorism. So I won't talk about the formation of Al-Qaeda as such. This is not going to be very interesting, since we all know that about the history of Al-Qaeda, its formation at the behest of the United States and other Western powers in Afghanistan. What about beyond Afghanistan? Well, it's very interesting, because after the departure of Soviet troops from Afghanistan and the collapse of the Soviet Union in about 1989, the anti-Soviet Afghan factions began competing for power. Although in 1991 the US and the USSR, they formally agreed to jointly seize aiding any faction in Afghanistan, in fact the Department of State remained anxious about who might emerge as the winner of this competition within Afghanistan amongst the different factions. According to a Swiss TV journalist by the name of Richard Lebivier, in his book Dollars for Terror, European intelligence sources that he cites revealed that the CIA and the Saudis, intent on securing a regime commensurate with their joint regional interests, agreed that they did not want to give up, quote, the assets of a profitable collaboration. Accordingly, in 1991, the CIA, Saudi intelligence and bin Laden held a series of meetings. Although exactly what was agreed upon remained secret, Lebivier, citing European intelligence sources, reports that the CIA remained determined to maintain some kind of influence in Afghanistan, which is of course the vital route to Central Asia, where the great oil companies have been preparing the energy El Dorado for the coming millennium. Labivier's findings are corroborated to some extent by other credible sources. We know for a fact that after the Soviet withdrawal, Osama bin Laden returned for a short period to Saudi Arabia to tend to the family construction business in Jeddah. But even after 1991, when Saudi security held on to bin Laden's passport, he had considerable influence in Saudi royal circles. He managed to lobby the Saudi royal family to organize civil defense in the kingdom and to raise a force from among the Afghan war veterans to fight Iraq. But the Saudi regime, they turned down his offer. Instead, they accepted the influx of 300,000 US soldiers. Now, according to the journalist Gerald Posner, as we know from NBC Today, this was the key point at which bin Laden decided to become an apparent enemy of the Saudi regime. But in April 1991, according to a classified US intelligence report, then head of Saudi intelligence services, Prince Turki al-Faisal, struck a secret deal with bin Laden, despite his being under house arrest for his opposition to the presence of US soldiers. Under this deal, although the regime would publicly disown him, bin Laden was permitted to leave Saudi Arabia with his funding and supporters. Moreover, the regime would continue to fund his activities on condition that he does not target the Saudi kingdom himself. The Posner's account of a secret agreement between bin Laden and Saudi intelligence is significant because he argues that this was known to US intelligence. This wasn't something that we didn't know. Lebivier also interviewed a CIA analyst about the role of the Mujahideen, and this CIA agent said, quote, that the policy of guiding the evolution of Islam and of helping them against our adversaries worked marvelously well in Afghanistan against the Red Army. The same doctrines can still be used to destabilize what remains of Russian power, and especially to counter the Chinese influence in Central Asia. Excuse me. So when I read this, I was quite surprised that could this really be possible? So I thought, how can we test this hypothesis? Why don't we have a look at these key regions, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Central Asia, and let's see if you can establish that some kind of connection continues to exist between the United States and Al-Qaeda. And as Peter rightly pointed out, we know for a fact that in the Balkans, the United States twice connected themselves with Al-Qaeda. In the first Bosnian War, the Pentagon set up, and this has came up in a number of ways. I suppose the most credible source is the official Dutch inquiry, which produced the Srebrenica report a few years ago, and based on Dutch intelligence sources. The Pentagon was flying in Mujahideen into Bosnia to manipulate the direction of the conflict, to the extent that, Yusuf Bodansky, who was director of the Congressional Task Force on Terrorism, his outlet said that US Special Forces were actually seen coming off planes with the Mujahideen. So this was a very close kind of coordination. The same kind of policy was implemented in Kosovo, as Peter noted. The KLA the State Department confirmed in 1998 that the KLA has connections to Al-Qaeda. A man by the name of Ralph Mutsch, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, he's a head of a department in Interpol. He actually testified before Congress in the year 2000, and he confirmed the same thing, that we know for a fact that Al-Qaeda has been funded. Al-Qaeda has been funding the KLA. There is an intermovement of people in terms of mujahideen. There is also movement of drugs and heroin and so on and so forth between these organizations. So there is a clear linkage there. At the same time, we know that before the Kosovo War, according to sources like the Sunday Times, the United States and Britain got involved, and we were training the KLA. The same people who, of course, were mingling with Al-Qaeda. And this is very worrying, because to go back to Badansky has pointed out that the Albanian mafia, which is tightly connected to the KLA, is laundering money, providing technology, safe houses, and other support to terrorists within this country, and of course within the UK. This is what he says. Badansky says, this isn't to say that the Albanians themselves would carry out their terrorist operations, but there are undoubtedly sleeper agents within the Albanian networks, and they can rely upon those networks to provide them with support. In any case, a serious investigation of the Albanian mob isn't going to happen, because they're our boys, they're protected. Now, this phenomenon didn't just occur in the Balkans. I looked at a number of key regions. I looked at North Africa, and the countries in there I looked at were Algeria and Libya. I also looked at the Asia Pacific, and I looked at the Philippines, and several other. I looked at the Caucasus, I looked at the Russian-Chechen conflict, and I found a very odd pattern. And I'll just to give you an idea, I'll look at North Africa and Algeria. Now, in Algeria, we have a conflict going on, where we have a secular regime which is fighting a kind of a radical minority group, which is affiliated by numerous reports to Al-Qaeda. One of the main organizations, terrorist groups active in Algeria is the GIA, which has spearheaded a campaign in the country. They've slaughtered something like 100,000 civilians. It's very well known, documented by numerous human rights groups. Now, the same group which has carried out these massacres, numerous reports have emerged in the British press. Defectors from the Algerian intelligence services have come out on record, and they've stated that the GIA has been manipulated and penetrated by Algerian intelligence services and is being used to consolidate the regime's power. Now, this would be, we have a very close relationship to the Algerian regime, the United States, Britain and Europe. We have very close ties due to the oil and gas there. We have very heavy investments. We also have very close military ties. Particularly the French government has very close military ties to the regime. The United States government has been involved with many new military programs with Algeria and so on and so forth. We're very tight with Algeria, and we do not want to damage this relationship. The problem arises when, is there a point where is there any information which suggests that we are aware of the fact that this is going on, apart from the fact this has come out on the public record? Well, interestingly, there was a trial in the UK from which emerged various classified Foreign Office documents. And the trial was actually about the case of some Algerian terrorists or alleged terrorists in the UK. What emerged from these Foreign Office documents was that the United States intelligence services and British intelligence services have been aware of this phenomenon for many years. Many reports talk about, this was reported in the Guardian newspaper, by the way. Many of the reports talked about the British reports saying that we are aware that we believe that the GIA has been manipulated by the Algerian secret services for their own ends. We believe that the Algerian secret services are completely unscrupulous, and so on and so forth. The US intelligence report was there saying that the 1995 Paris bombings, which were blamed on Algerian militants, the GIA, we believe that probably at least one of the bombs was carried out when ordered by the Algerian secret services, and we do not have any evidence to suggest that the GIA actually carried this out, and so on and so forth. And I found that the same pattern was prevalent in the Philippines, very much similar. We had the Abu Sayyaf, a terrorist organization which we must emphasize was heavily tied to 9/11. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, was based in the Philippines, a member of Abu Sayyaf. It was in the Philippines that they hatched the Project Boyinka plan, which was the blueprint behind 9/11, as is now well known. It was hatched in 1995. It had two dimensions. One dimension was to blow up 11 airliners or so over the Pacific. Another was to hijack civilian planes and hurl them into key buildings in the United States. Now, the Abu Sayyaf, again, I looked at Philippine sources, Philippine newspapers. I went through the records, and I have a public address from a guy by the name of Senator Pimentel, who is a very prominent legislator in the Philippines. He gave a public address before the Philippine Senate, and he said, I have information that the Abu Sayyaf has been handled by Philippine military intelligence. He even named officials who were working in the Philippine military at that time and said, we need to investigate these people. He named one guy by the name of Edwin Angeles, who was supposedly a leader of the Abu Sayyaf, and he said that this man is actually a double agent. He's been an informant for years, and this subsequently came out. It actually emerged. It was a whole scandal in the Philippine press. And again, we have a very close relationship to the Philippine regime. There was I have a quote from a U.S. major there who was saying that we work here as counterparts. We have co-generals, co-directors. We have one troop for every Philippine troop. We're working very closely on this counter-terrorist offensive against what's happening. So, I mean, I don't want to go into detail, but I discussed this
because we don't have time.
Yeah, we don't have time. But suffice to say, in conclusion, that this is a phenomenon I've discovered to be prevalent throughout many regions in the Middle East and Central Asia. It's a very worrying phenomenon. And it fundamentally challenges the whole paradigm of the war on terror. That if we are allying ourselves in some manner with Al-Qaeda in this rather direct way, how can we fight a war and win? It just doesn't make any sense. The first thing we need to do is go to the source of our policy and correct that before we want to fight a war. And I would suggest that we need to look exactly at what we're doing in this respect before we go around invading other countries and saying that we're going to go and solve terrorism through military invasion.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I have dozens of questions, but I am going to forego my questions because I think they would pale in comparison to the questions that our experts can provide for this panel. However, I would just like to say that this testimony will be made available for the record, and I hope to have the opportunity through the good graces of C-SPAN to reveal my thoughts on this particular panel and any other panel on which I forego questions at the proper time. Right now, we will go to our panel of expert questioners, starting with Mr. Rupert.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I really enjoyed listening to this, and we've heard these correlations between Iran-Contra and the present day keep occurring. And aside from the fact that so many members of the same administration that ran Iran-Contra are back in this administration, I'm left with one fundamental question. We know, and I know that Peter knows very well, that much of the funding for the so-called Contra effort, which was a U.S. ally, was provided by the illicit drug trade. However, we do also know that in the year prior to the attacks of 9/11, the Taliban destroyed 94% of the opium crop in Afghanistan, so that there was virtually no opium growing on September the 11th. And my question remains, of course, I have serious questions about the definition of this thing, Al-Qaeda, whether it's a noun, a verb, an adjective. I don't know what it is. It's an amorphous concept. But it is preposterous for me to assume that Al-Qaeda, whatever it is now being funded by drug money, since Afghanistan is now thoroughly under the control of the U.S. military, especially warlords, the opium warlords, many of whom were released by the CIA from prison. And Afghani opium production since 9/11, of course, has multiplied and multiplied again geometrically to the point where it's now, I think the last harvest was, what, Peter, close to 5,000 metric tons in Afghanistan, supplying now 78% of the world's opium supply, but we can't blame that on Al-Qaeda. So my question remains how is this amorphous thing called Al-Qaeda getting its money? And from whom? And from where?
I'd like to comment about the Taliban suppression of the opium, which is absolutely confirmed, no question of it. It was also for only 1 year, so that, or actually a year and a half, but effectively for 1 year. And so the question arises, was this what they were going to do for the rest of time, or was this an adjustment of the market to drive up prices? And on that point, I think there is no agreement. I think also there's been a lot of fudging in this country about the fact, because we could hardly proclaim a war on drugs in Afghanistan because we were going to war against the Taliban, which had just outlawed it, and whose effectiveness we had recognized, and we were going to use as our ally Massoud and the Northern Alliance, who did more than anyone else to pick up the slack, and they trebled their production in the same period. So we definitely went into Afghanistan as the allies of the drug traffickers rather than the opponents of them. I'm not as offended by this now as I was when I wrote Drugs, Oil, and War, because it was clear that Bush was not going to come through with the money that was needed to reconstruct Afghanistan or even to keep it alive. And much as I dislike the global drug traffic and the people who conduct it, the fact of the matter is that people lasted through that first Afghan winter largely because there was a drug trade. And there is now the beginnings of an effort to cut back on it. And if Karzai is ever going to control more than Kabul, most rulers of Afghanistan have not been able to do this, but if he is ever going to do it, he's going to have to go after the regional warlords. And there is some sign that in a very slow way this is beginning to happen. So I'm not going to be as condemnatory of our use of drug traffickers as I was at one time. Now, as to what's happening now, I think that since 9/11, Al-Qaeda, if it's worth using the name at all, describes a phenomenon that has changed very radically, has become very much more polycentric. I think the role of central leadership and planning and so on is no longer what it was. And I mean, I think what we're beginning to learn about London is proof of this. But the case of Madrid is very, very interesting, because here were people who had past Al-Qaeda connections, no question. But their involvement with the drug, or some of them, the involvement of some of them with the local drug traffic was very, very marked and visible. And I think that maybe one of the things that's going to hold these various groups of bombers and around the world is going to be the drug traffic itself. Just as, to flip it over, for a long time the global drug traffic enjoyed the immunity that it did, or the impunity, I'm not sure which word we should use, because in country after country, the people who were overseeing the drug traffic in that country were intelligence networks who in turn were protected by their relationship to U.S. intelligence agencies and the CIA. So the globalization of terrorism, which we heard about, has to do, I think, with the globalization of the drug traffic, which has been a byproduct of the CIA's consistent and repeated reliance on drug assets to get outside of congressional budget.
Very quick follow-up. Would it be correct to say then that he or she or it who controls the global drug trade would therefore control the jugular vein of terrorist financing?
Well, I don't see it
yes or no?
as unified as that, particularly not now. It was perhaps more unified 20 years ago than it is today.
Thank you.
Can I answer? Because I think there is a little bit of confusion. I mean, the financing of terrorism is an extremely complex issue. Now, drug trade is very important. It is the most important entry. But let's not forget that 1/3 of the $500 billion which are generated every year by armed organizations around the world actually is produced by legitimate businesses. So this is one of the problems in the so-called financial war on terror, is the fact that we have focused far too much on dirty money and not at all on clean money, which are then dirty by the armed organizations when they use it for attacks. What we're seeing today in the evolution of Al-Qaeda, which we should really not talk about Al-Qaeda anymore, is not the pyramidal organization highly integrated with the cupola as it was before 9/11. It actually has become an ideology. We should be talking about Al-Qaedism. And for these people who actually want to join in, who want to emulate 9/11, because this is the pattern that we're seeing in London, and we also have seen in Madrid. For these people, this Al-Qaedism is the only anti-imperialist ideology available today. And I think we have to look at that from this point of view. And then within that, the funding, what we're seeing in Europe, is becoming very similar to the funding of the Marxist armed organization of the 1970s, which means self-funded. There is no movement of money anymore. The movement of money is actually in the Muslim world. It is within the Islamic banking system. The money are actually moving within the system and then reach Iraq. This is where the old-style financiers of Osama bin Laden are actually sending their money, not in Europe, not inside the US. So the situation today is much, much more complex, more difficult to track the money also. Imagine that the London bombing probably cost less than $10,000. It was all in cash, and it probably was raised by the people within this informal radical mosque or within the community of supporters. How are you going to track those money? It's really difficult.
Well, I really enjoyed this panel. I have 1,000 questions, but it's one, and my question is, could you describe your feelings on what obviously is a nexus between past criminal conspirators involved in the Afghan war, BCCI, Iran-Contra, even going through Enron, which replaced BCCI as a Bush family cartel and slush fund. The nexus between these criminal conspirators, it's been described they're in this administration, and the neoconservatives, many of them embrace that particular political ideology, and these Christian dominionists who also embrace much of the neoconservative ideology, who all believe in the end times and things like that, and that people who are willing to out and expose a covert CIA network designed to find the where weapons of mass destruction are being bought and sold. If people would do this, and they have a past criminal record, would these neoconservatives, these past criminal conspirators, in your opinion, have actively sought to suppress the intelligence prior to 9/11 to give them a reason to pass things like the Patriot Act, to do this projection of American power around the world through their manifesto, which was the Project for a New American Century, because their ideological soulmates, who were the National Socialists in Germany, burned down their own parliament building to get the Enabling Act passed, which shredded the German Constitution. So my question is, how far do you think these neoconservatives, many of whom are past political conspirators, would go? Because we're talking about intelligence broke down. Nobody was held accountable. I think the only guy that lost his job on 9/11 was the head of security at Logan Airport. Everyone else got promoted or got presidential freedom medals and things like that. And John O'Neill, Mike mentioned, lost his job, also lost his life, but he was really after these al-Qaeda networks in Yemen, and he was thrown out by the U.S. ambassador. So we have hundreds and hundreds of examples like that. So how far do you think they would have gone, and do you think it would be possible for the neoconservatives, with their philosophy, to have purposely allowed 9/11 to happen by ignoring intelligence, even maybe facilitating some of these terrorist cells that came to the United States?
Well, one can only speculate about this. I can't come up with neat facts or documents or anything that would prove it, and I like normally to stick to the level of documents. We heard this morning Mel Goodman in a speech, which generally I found very interesting. He said this wasn't an institutional failure, it was a personal failure. And then Mike Rupert came back and said this was A, deliberate, and B, systemic. And my own position is halfway in between. I do think that there was deliberate, whatever happened on 9/11, whether they let it happen, made it happen, whatever, it's an event which some people wished for. There's been too many. This, I think, was a cliche in the sort of high-tech, big-budget military thing that without another Pearl Harbor, we're not going to get the budgets we need. And I think at a minimum there were some people who said, we have our Pearl Harbor, and proceeded to act accordingly. I don't see this as being the system, though. I think that this all goes back, in a sense, to the church reforms which Mel Goodman praised this morning, because they created a situation where the CIA and, in general, the intelligence community was no longer the unsupervised arena that it had been before. It became, even if only minimally, under some kind of congressional review and minimal accountability. The result was we saw the beginning of offshoring and offloading of covert operations. The best example, perhaps, being Casey, CIA Director Casey's use of BCCI, and also the elaborate arrangements for supporting the Contras. Congress has said, don't do it. So instead of not doing it, you just go elsewhere to find the assets to do it. And this has created a kind of global symbiosis between the agents who are supposed to be defending the United States and the people on the other side whom we're supposed to be defending ourselves against. There is a great deal, I think, of interaction. Double agents, triple agents, people like Saeed Sheikh and Ali Mohammed. There is a milieu growing up that's in between the two. And it's a time for cabals. I think PNAC should be called a cabal, and not the only cabal. I don't put the Christian fundamentalists in this picture at all. I think they believe too sincerely what they're doing to be major players on this abstract international level. But when you have this kind of milieu, and you have this kind of 20, 30 years now of experience with offloaded intelligence operations, you can say that it's not just because Bush was elected. This was something that was going to happen, something like this, because of that degree of interpenetration between the so-called defenders and the so-called enemy, both of which need to be looked at much more acutely by the public and Congress than they are at present.
Could I say a word in defense of the neoconservatives, not a position in which I usually find myself? I think it is a mistake to look for a kind of conspiracy gotcha moment here, and that for the following reason. First, because I'm completely convinced that the majority of neoconservatives, like as Mr. Scott said of the Christian fundamentalists, believe in what they're doing quite sincerely. What is dangerous in politics is not our vices, that is to say, nefarious activities in which people engage in mindfully, that sort of double agent, triple agent, spy versus spy, but rather our virtues, that the deeply held convictions of the neoconservatives, that it would be better for the few to lead the many, that it would be better for the Middle East to be reconfigured by the United States, that these very sincerely held beliefs are a problem, that it's not when they depart from their beliefs, but when they fulfill them, that the nation is maybe most endangered, and that looking at tiny events for that gotcha moment directs our gaze away from these broad movements in American politics, repeated in American foreign policy over not only over the course of years, but over the course of decades. The expansion of executive power at home, on the domestic front, that all these things are so profound, so persistent, and so dangerous that any event pales in comparison to those, and that we need to keep our eye on the broad directions of American foreign policy and the broad directions of American domestic political change in order to appreciate what the true effects of this change has been.
Could I just come in very briefly, to comment on your question? My position is really that rather than coming out and arguing a particular overarching conclusion or theory at this stage, it's of more value for the people who we want to kind of promote a kind of an independent investigation. We want to expose the anomalies in the previous investigation. It's of more value to point out the fact that, well, why did they fail given the abundance of information available? And to say, I would concur somewhat with what Peter said, in the sense that it seems pretty clear to me that at some level there were deliberate decisions made by various individuals to simply either obstruct investigations or ignore investigations and so on and so forth. That is absolutely clear. Now, the question is how far did that go? Now, I don't think we need to, at this stage, say, we don't need to discount anything and say, well, it's completely impossible that this could have been allowed or arranged or whatever. But at this stage, if we focus on absolutely fact, we can pinpoint these particular failures and these particular events which occurred where investigations were blocked, obstructed, information was there, available, and wasn't acted on. It doesn't make any sense. I find it quite inexplicable. But I won't come out and say, this is my explanation. It's very difficult. But I think the important thing is to point out the failures itself and to say this has not been explained at all by the Commission. And I think if we do that, we will be able to make headway with pushing for some kind of more public disclosure on this.
I certainly agree with that last statement. I'm thinking what an idea and insight-rich panel. I thank you all, panelists, and those who invited you. I'd like to pick up on two comments, one by Peter Dale Scott and the other by Ann Norton, and try to combine them. What Peter Dale Scott said about the answer not being war, but justice. And what Ann said about the fact that of the 567 pages of this extraordinary report, there are only 3 or so that had to do with the political background and factors at work here, which, if my math is right, that's less than 0.5%. It drove me back here to my dog-eared copy of this, and what I'd like to do is read one sentence from each of those 3 pages, and then I would ask for your comment. First sentence, page 147, for those who have your Bibles with you. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's animus toward the United States stemmed from his violent disagreement with U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel. Page 375. By 2003, this is right after, these are polls taken after 9/11, and after the invasion of Iraq. By 2003, polls showed that the, quote, the bottom had fallen out of support for America in most of the Muslim world. Again, this is after the invasion of Iraq, but before Abu Ghraib. Then comes the subhead, engage the struggle of ideas. Sounds promising. The government must define what our message is. This is a recommendation. American foreign policy is part of the message. America's policy choices have consequences. Right or wrong, it is simply a fact. that American policy regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and American actions in Iraq are... Would either or both of you please finish that sentence? I'll read the first part again, put you on the spot here. Right or wrong, it is simply a fact that American policy regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and American actions in Iraq are...
Well, I don't have my copy with me. I think what they said was contributing to the problem or something like that.
Well, I'm interested in what you think.
What do
is
I
this
think?
Is this why they hate us?
What I think is, yes, we have, by a factor of 10, multiplied the likelihood of terrorist attacks by invading Iraq. I think we should not overestimate America's ability to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, although that would certainly, I think, be one of the best things one could do to mitigate the dangers of terrorism. But we have... And we've sort of lost control of our destiny in Iraq, too, now. But ultimately, I wrote this last November in Salon, we are going to have to withdraw. And if that's the case, the best time to do it is sooner rather than later. We're going to lose face if we withdraw now. We will lose more face if we withdraw later. And I'd like to make the analogy with Vietnam here, because I've just been living in Thailand. I know a bit now about Thai history. In the course of fighting the war in Vietnam, America was essentially creating a revolutionary movement in Thailand. Mm-hmm. And everyone was saying, well, of course, if America leaves, the dominoes will fall and the whole region will be communist. Well, you just have to look at the region now. It's where people go to lie on beaches and buy little Buddhas and things like that. Mm-hmm. America achieved its goals by withdrawing from Vietnam. That was the beginning where pro-American sentiment began to rise and anti-American sentiment began very drastically to fade away, not just in Vietnam, with whom we're now quite friendly, but in the whole of Southeast Asia, which really was being radicalized, revolutionized by the American presence. And those revolutionary movements, and with them the military dictatorships which we were responsible for installing, all of that melted away, and you have the makings now of not perfect societies, but definitely much better societies than we had before. So that's my act of faith, that if we could do the same thing in Iraq and pull back, that you would see a diminishing of anti-American sentiment and a growth of gratitude for America. We have done some good things in the region, and we could do more in a peaceful way.
Thank you. Ann?
I'm a partisan of do the right thing, whatever the consequences. But I have also noted, and particularly with regard to American policy in the Middle East, how very tragic good intentions can be. Mm-hmm. The American alliance with Israel, I think, is on the one hand one of the most honorable things about the United States. It's evidence of a desire to back democracies. It's a recognition that the democracies we back might be very different than our own. A nation that puts gives a public place to religion, that has birthright citizenship based on descent rather than on residence or on commitment. It is, and a desire to outdo Europe, not only to avoid the genocides that Europe saw, but to shelter at home and abroad populations that have been the subject of genocide. But in this very honorable task, the United States has taken on a series of actions that betray both itself and the ideals that it advanced in the alliance with Israel. The movement away from democracy, which is often justified. Well, we need to learn from the Israelis how to discipline democracy. Torture is legitimate in a good cause. the forgetting of the requirement of democracy in Palestine. And similarly, it would be, it's an extraordinary ambition, and to want to reconfigure the Middle East in a democratic direction. But the notion that democracy is something that grows from the barrel of a gun is much more difficult to support. And so I think that kind of consistent self-betrayal in American policy is indeed something that Americans must consider very thoroughly, and should have considered when they look to the political events of 9/11.
I'm certain that this panel could go on and on and on, because we're really getting to the heart of some very important issues that this Congress needs to deal with. But we do have time constraints. And so in the real world, I would just like to thank the members of this panel for their wonderful, riveting, honest, thoughtful presentations, and introduce our new moderator for the remainder of the afternoon, Ms. Rabia Rayford.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Rabia Rayford. I am a political and social activist in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm a former board member of Washington, D.C.'s WPFW Pacifica Radio, local advisory board member. And as we're taking our seats, I wanted to say that I'm very encouraged by this panel. I'm hoping that this will somehow translate into the schools. We need more young people here and listening to this, because they are the ones that are going to pass this on. I also want to say that I'm very encouraged by some of the topics that are coming up. And I'm happy that the members of September 11th Families for a Peaceful Tomorrow are here. I got to meet a couple of the members before. I'm also former interim press secretary for Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. And I met a lot of very focused, committed, and dedicated individuals through Congresswoman, and I'm very grateful for that. My best friend is a physician, and one of the things that she says about war is that at some point we're all going to have to come together to talk to each other anyway, so why don't we begin with conversation? On that note, I want to introduce some of the speakers. Wayne Smith, who's a former diplomat with and a member of the Center on International Policy. He will be speaking on foreign policy, immediate response and recommendations, and the end of international law. Should I? Okay. I've been told Bob McIlvaine has already been introduced. Also, we will have, but he will be speaking on alternatives to Pax Americana and permanent war. And he is also a member of the September 11th Families for a Peaceful Tomorrow. Next, we will go to domestic policy, immediate response and recommendations. Dual legal systems and military tribunals will be addressed by Kit Gage. Kit Gage is president and founder of the National Coalition to Protect Political Freedoms and has directed the First Amendment Foundation and National Committee Against Repressive Legislation since April 2001. Ms. Gage is a regular contributor to various journals on matters concerning freedom of speech and other civil liberties, immigrant rights, women's rights, and other human rights issues. Gage was Executive Vice President and earlier the first legal worker Vice President of the National Lawyers Guild. She also served as a board member of the Guatemala Human Rights Commission, USA. She is a graduate of Grinnell College and with an independent degree in women's socialization and conflict, and is married and has 2 remarkable adult daughters. Just to backtrack on Wayne Smith, he's a senior fellow and director at the Center for International Policy. He directs the Cuba program and is a contributor to the National Security Program. He is also a visiting professor of Latin American Studies and director of the University of Havana Exchange Program at Johns Hopkins. He's a former senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. During his 25 years with the State Department, 1957 to 82, he served as executive secretary of President Kennedy's Latin American Task Force and chief of mission at the U.S. Interest Section in Havana. In addition, he served in Argentina, Brazil, and the Soviet Union. We will also be looking at civil liberties in American post-911. Is security worth the trade? Speaking will be Mary Rose Okar, who's the president of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, ADC. Ms. Okar is a longtime resident of Cleveland, Ohio, who received her BA at Ursuline College, her MA at John Carroll University, both in Cleveland.
Thank you.
Ms. Okar is a former professor and has received several honorary doctorates. Okar has served on the Cleveland City Council, the Ohio House of Representatives, and for 16 years in the United States of Representatives. In Congress, she advocated for peace and justice in the Middle East and for those of Middle Eastern ancestry in the United States. In addition, she served as a monitor for the Palestinian elections and has attended Middle East peace signings at the White House in Egypt and Jordan, and once accompanied President Clinton to Syria. McCall's magazine named Okar one of the 10 best members of Congress for health and women's issues, and she has received numerous awards for her legislation concerning breast cancer in the elderly. Okay. Next, we will be having Elaine Cassell, who is an author of The War on Civil Liberties, which documents the erosion of civil liberties, rights, and liberties under the Bush administration. She's an attorney, a professor of law at Concord and Marymount Universities, and is a regular contributor for Find Law and the blog Civil Liberties Watch. After that, we will be looking at the rise of secrecy after 9/11. And with us will be Rebecca Daughtry, who is from the Reporters Commission on Freedom of the Press. Then we will go on to the Patriot Act's Sunset on Freedom, and we'll be hearing from William Michaels, who is the author of No Greater Threat, and then we will have questions. Jumana Musa is also joining us, and she is with Amnesty International. All of the panel members on here? And could you please go in the order presented?
Thank you.
Yes. The first person should be Mr. Wayne Smith.
Yes, now it is. The title, The End of International Law, I don't think is meant to suggest that the 9/11 Commission's report will mean the end of international law. If you read the statements of the Bush administration and analyze its attitudes and actions towards international law and international conventions and agreements, you might begin to reach that conclusion.
Excuse me, I'm having difficulty hearing you. Could you please move the microphone closer to your mouth?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. What?
Move the mic closer to your mouth. She's having trouble hearing.
Like that?
Yeah.
Yes.
There we go.
Better.
Okay, good. Now I can hear you too. This is not, as we were told initially, as first pictures of Abu Ghraib came out, we were told that just the isolated acts of rogue soldiers, any mistreatment, no, this is not a part of a pattern at all. Well, it was, as it turns out, a part of a pattern. We've heard the recent testimony of the generals up here on the Hill acknowledging that, yes, it was a practice according to the instructions given by the Pentagon, stripping the prisoners, making them wear women's underwear on their head to degrade them and humiliate them. And as we've seen in other memos and testimony, there was a practice of chaining prisoners in a fetal position and so forth. So now, one of the generals the other day said that, well, these practices didn't really get over into torture. They may have been degrading, they may have been embarrassing, but didn't get into torture. We've also seen the Justice Department memos some time back, which sort of held forth that unless the pain was up to that of a surgical incision without anesthetic, that it really didn't count for torture. And over again, we've heard that the Geneva Conventions don't really apply because these are not the soldiers of a regular army serving a foreign government with which we are at war. I would put forward that all this about the Geneva Conventions and the excuses for the mistreatment of prisoners is utter nonsense. None of it is based on international law. None of it is based on common sense. The 9/11 Commission report says that the United States should engage its friends to develop a common coalition approach toward the detention and humane treatment of captured terrorists. New principles might draw upon Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions on the Law of Armed Conflict. That article was specifically designed for those cases in which the usual laws of war did not apply. In other words, these cases in which our government tells us the Geneva Conventions don't apply. The minimum standards are generally accepted throughout the world as customary international law. What does Article 3 call for? Well, among other things, it prohibits outrages, and this is for those to whom the Geneva Conventions might not apply, but it prohibits strictly outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliating and degrading treatment. So all these practices, stripping the prisoners naked, putting women's underwear or perhaps even men's underwear on their heads, is degrading treatment. It is prohibited by international law. We are violating international law as we get down to those practices. And I can't remember another time in American history, I'm not ageless, but I have lived a long time, and I don't remember ever having been ashamed of what we were doing to foreign prisoners. In World War II, we treated prisoners well. Even, let's say, soldiers, but even German spies arrested in the United States were not treated in a degrading manner. They were not humiliated. They were treated according to the law. And it is not. I can hear Karl Rove now saying that these fuzzy-thinking people just want to cozy up to the terrorists, treat them like teddy bears, of course. It isn't that at all. It is a matter of respecting international law, yes, but also degrading treatment, the inhumane treatment of prisoners is dumb. Dumb because, as most intelligence experts will tell you, information received as a result of such acts is highly questionable, if not worthless. You start pushing someone around, and eventually they'll say what you want to hear, whether it's true or not, and you can't rely upon it. But beyond that, how do we think that this is going to go over in the Muslim world? As the pictures, as the testimony of the treatment of these prisoners comes out in the Muslim world, it is certain, has and will continue to fuel passions against us. Now, I'm not saying this is the cause of the problem. Of course, 9/11 happened before we had any terrorist prisoners. But this is not an intelligent way to proceed in our struggle against terrorism. We ought to get back to full respect for international law and fully humane treatment of all prisoners without any exception. Thank you. Oh, sorry. It's okay. You good?
Yeah.
Bob,
Mr.
yes.
McIlvaine.
My name's Bob McIlvaine. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You get a break. I'm the only non-expert this whole day has seen, so although I do speak a lot. When my son was murdered, I immediately was against our action in Afghanistan. Primarily because it's my son's legacy, not that he was a pacifist. He just truly was such a great, great intellect. And I remember a week before he died, this is the killer for me.
That's all right, Mr. McIlvaine. We are with you.
The week before he died, we talked about the Taliban. He says, Dad, I really think they're going to go after the Taliban. And I said, why? And he said, well, if you've been reading things about the oil, they want to put the pipeline through there. He knew that we wanted to run the pipeline through, that we had been negotiating with the Taliban. And of course, because of him, I've always stayed up on current affairs, but nothing like I ever should have. And next week he dies. And I said, my goodness. Now we're going to go to war against Afghanistan and the Taliban. And that conversation I had with him really resonated. And I said, this is absurd. And I started thinking about what someone had said previously. It's about justice. We can catch this man. This is the one opportunity, probably in the history of mankind, that the whole world would have united, saying this is absolutely insane. 3,000 people were slaughtered. Innocent civilians. Not that it's never happened before, but here in America. And I really felt optimistic. I would have said to myself, I could really live with my son's death if the world got together and found the murderers of my son. But of course, that never happened. So I just looked for an outlet. I didn't know who to talk to. I went on the web. I just wanted to find people that felt the way I did. My sister, my brother. Of course we should go in Afghanistan. We have to defend our freedoms. And I said, what do you mean our freedoms? My sister says, well, we have a right to drive SUVs. We have a right to do certain things, and this is what this is all about. They took our freedoms away. And God bless my sister. I said to her, Sue, just make an effort to look for information. There's so much information out there, and I'm not going to sit here and lecture you. And damn it, she didn't do that. And now she's working with me with Peaceful Tomorrows. We're going to Japan Sunday, and we're going to walk with the survivors of the atomic bomb, the bombing of 45. And we're going to walk with a stone, like we did last year. This is some of the things that Peaceful Tomorrows does. It's a tombstone honoring the civilians killed in war. And that's what our whole group is about. And that's what I'm about. I get the opportunity, and it's difficult. It was extremely difficult to hear Lori's testimony and to hear her husband. Because I still don't know how my son died. I don't know if he jumped. I did get a body. But then we couldn't view it. So it is very difficult, and this is why so many people have a difficulty getting involved in all this. My wife can't. She screams at me if I come home and tell some of these things that I've heard. It's too disheartening to think that all these things are happening and then our innocent people are murdered. Well, anyway, I know I don't have that much time, but I've spent my whole life trying to, in honor of my son, to understand why my son was murdered. And I work with Peaceful Tomorrows, and we have been nominated for 2 Nobel Peace Prizes. It gives me a good feeling to work with them. But on my own, I'm in constant search. And hearing from Michael and Ray and all these people, these experts, it's connecting the dots. I speak to a lot of high schools, a lot of colleges, and I try to urge them, connect the dots. Go back to World War I. This silly war of World War I, yet so many people had to die. And I try to run it through to 2001 and say, this is the reason my son is dead. It's a cause and effect type of thing. And I'll explain to him, I'm not a researcher, or I'm not an expert, but please try to find it on your own. Well, I finally found Peaceful Tomorrows in about October of 2002, searching that website. And as a group, it was founded in February of 2002. And it was the name is based upon Martin Luther King's speech, "Wars are poor chisels for peaceful tomorrows." And we live by that. War is insane. So we'll do anything. Our biggest project coming up, we're having an international conference on terrorism at Princeton University in 2006. We're trying to get a coalition of civilians, victims, from all around the world as victims, and I hate to call myself a victim, please don't think of me as a victim, but we have to come together and make the solution that war is never, ever, ever, ever the answer. Justice is the answer. And we have to live by that. I had the unbelievable opportunity to go to Bogota. I haven't flown since 9/11. Not that I was necessarily afraid, but I just wouldn't fly. I learned too much about the shoot bomber. I said, I'm just not going to leave the country. But Bogota, they had an international conference on violence and terrorism. They called me to speak down there. And I decided to do it. And it was truly a harrowing experience. I won't go into that. But there's probably about 2,000 people in the row, or in the auditorium. The first 2 rows are all victims just of Colombia, the violence. 13-year-olds with legs missing, the burn victims. I sat down with, I had dinner with one burn victim, 75% of her body, an African Colombian. She lost her 3 children and her husband. And I said, damn, I feel sorry for myself sometimes. And that woman could sit there and laugh with me because you have that bond with people who have suffered. And that's the thing we all have to think about. It's the civilians, the 25,000 civilians in Iraq that have died. The 500,000 people in Iraq that have died through the 90s. What is this foreign policy that we have? We talk about Pax America. I think literally in Latin, does that not mean American peace? Are we perpetrating peace on this world? Have we since 1945? After the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Oh, I think not. So, as it gives me so much comfort to work with this 9/11 group because somehow, some way, we are going to find peace. And it's important to me to go out into the community. And I learned so much from the experts. And I've quoted you many times, Ray, since our last talk. If you're not angry at what's happening around the rest of the world, every day of your life you have to be angry. And if you're not, you're an unjust person. Almost this quote, right, from St. Thomas Aquinas. Ray talked about that the other day. So anger is, to me, very important. Anger keeps me focused because when I'm not angry, I get mellow. And then I drop away from all this. And it's truly a double-edged sword. The more I'm involved in it, it destroys me. But I get up from doing this. Then I'll go home and I'll get depressed. That's why family members find it very difficult to get involved in this. But the alternative was I was supposed to speak of. The alternative is you just got to keep demanding peace. You got to talk the talk. And more importantly, because when you sit down with people and say, well, we should have peace, they look at you, yeah, how are we going to find it? Well, that's where you have to know your history. That's where you have to say, well, look what happened here. This is why we had this happen and that happening. And they said, boy, you got a good point, because that's what happened to my sister. She finally went on the internet and researched everything. She just said, I always thought the United States is doing the right thing. And now she believes that, no, this isn't happening. And now she's working for peace. So that's so important, and especially in the educational system. We have to teach what is happening in Israeli-Palestine. An objective look at it. All these things. We must teach World War I differently. What happened after World War I. It's the kids of this country, the kids of the world, they have to get, that's the only reality to me is truth. And that is very evasive. But the thing is, if we get kids around the world, and that's one thing that we have in Peaceful Tomorrows, we speak around the world, and we will keep pushing that effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McIlvaine. Next, we will go straight into domestic policy, immediate response and recommendations, and we will hear from Kit Gage and Jumana Musa on dual legal systems and military tribunals. Thank you. Ms. Gage, would you like to go first?
I sure would. Thank you. Mr. McIlvaine, you said that you're not an expert. But you're clearly an expert in seeking justice. And I can't imagine a more important kind of expertise in the universe than seeking justice, so I wouldn't apologize a minute for what you do. I want to get to some basics here. I know you've talked about a whole range of important things today. But I want to talk about how you try to find justice with dealing with those who commit terrorist acts. Start out. What is terrorism? Simple question. What's terrorism? There's definitions, but the most commonly understood definition is a simple one. It's a crime that's committed to intimidate a government or a people. Simple. It is a crime trying to intimidate. It can be a little crime, it can be a big crime, it can be a horrible crime. And the kind of terrorism we're talking about now, we, the U.S. government, have declared war on terrorism, a perpetual war on terrorism, an endless war on terrorism. That's a really big handful. It's a really big challenge, because all of a sudden you're not talking about World War I or World War II. You're talking about an endless time frame. Because it's clear, terrorism's been around since the year dot. It's not going away. People always have committed crimes to intimidate other people. Okay, so we have this war on terrorism. How do you possibly try to punish people who are accused of terrorism? It's another fair question. It's impossible to imagine how you could possibly punish someone who committed the horrible attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and Pennsylvania. You can't, it's kind of a disconnect. You can't imagine the kind of things you could do to people to kind of rectify that. You have to sort of throw that away. But okay, so how in a real world do we try to find people who commit terrorist acts? And what do we do with them? Do you try them like you consider normal criminals that the U.S. Constitution calls for? Do you treat them in an international system along the lines of the Geneva Conventions, which envisions in an international scheme what you do? Or do you throw that all away and just toss them in the clink forever? Or do you have some other variation on that theme that incorporates some pieces or another of all of those? I want to look at since 9/11. I'm going to be brief, but I want to look at since 9/11 what we've done, and even a little before. You got to look though at how people are caught. Are they on the battlefield? Are they at home? Are they U.S. citizens? Are they not U.S. citizens? Those all help to determine what you're going to do to try to bring people to justice. Okay, what did we do on the battlefield? We had John Walker Lind, U.S. citizen. What do? We're going to try him. U.S. court of law. We had Yasser Hamdi, U.S. citizen, found in a battlefield. We said, well, maybe not. Maybe not any kind of court of law. In fact, we're just going to bring him to the U.S. and put him in a detention center, and he doesn't have to have a lawyer, and he doesn't have to hear any charges, and we don't have to figure out whether whatever he did is whatever he did. Two very similar examples, completely different choices that the U.S. government made. At home, look at Oklahoma City. No one can possibly argue that's not a terrorist crime. What did we do? We found the people we thought committed the crime, or at least a couple of them, and we tried them in a court of law. U.S. Constitution, full range of rights, lawyers, see the evidence, judge, jury, etc. One of them's dead, one of them's in jail for the rest of his life. We used the criminal justice system. Nobody argued about it. Jose Padilla, maybe not. Found not even committing a crime, found on an airplane, landing in O'Hare Airport, but accused of being a heinous terrorist. Maybe he is. But the U.S. chose to treat him completely differently from the Oklahoma City bombers. Now, there's a couple differences here. Maybe it's too obvious to point out that there's some ethnic differences on these guys. That could be a factor. But it points out that even the U.S. government has treated people with very similar fact patterns in completely different ways. And I think that points to a really critical thing. The U.S. government is perfectly capable of using the criminal justice system to try people it believes have committed horrible criminal terrorist activity. And when it doesn't, it's interesting what happens. But look at Mr. Padilla. Now we have, as he has been in jail since May of 2002, the courts have gone back and forth. Finally, he's gotten a lawyer. Finally, he's seen some of the evidence. Finally, now, a couple days ago, he gets a hearing in the Fourth Circuit after the U.S. Supreme Court finally tells the government, you really have to give this guy some kind of a hearing. We're not telling you exactly what kind, but some kind of a hearing. Okay, so 2 days ago, he's finally got his hearing. It's 3 years later. We still don't know whether we don't have charges against him yet. We don't know whether precisely this guy has committed or was planning to commit any terrorist crime. And that uncertainty, I'd argue, is really a problem in the overall plan to try to pursue terrorists. Mr. Hamdi, the U.S. Supreme Court said, you got to give this guy a hearing. You've got to give him a hearing. And the U.S. got so scared about the possibility of giving him a hearing, it let him go. It deported him. He's now in Saudi Arabia. As far as I know, not in jail, not charged with a crime. Before 9/11, I worked with a group, and I'm wrapping up with this, that dealt with the issue of secret evidence. The U.S. was using secret evidence to deport people, to try to deport them. And we, through the process of finally getting these guys in court and demanding that the government let the secret evidence be opened up to the public, we discovered the government, in many cases, was wrong. It didn't have what it thought it had. The people who it was holding for because they thought they did certain things hadn't really done them. And most of those folks got let go without having been deported because the government said, oops. It seems to me that we don't want to say oops when we're going after terrorists, and particularly not when we're talking about the serious kinds of events, horrible events that have been going on in London and in New York, and will continue to go on in Oklahoma City and wherever, will continue to go on, hopefully less, but will go on. We have to develop a mechanism that tells us that we have the right people, tells us, to the extent that the law works, that these are the people who should be held in jail. These are the people who should be held accountable, and not somebody else. And this just goes, I'm not talking about Guantanamo. I'm not talking about what's gone on in Iraq and Afghanistan and other countries. This, in some ways, these are the people about whom they have had the most rights, the most visibility. So it makes it even more important, on to what Jemana's going to be talking about, that we have some consistency. We have a policy that is rational, but that looks to more than 200 years of law, of mistakes, of efforts to try to find justice, to try to seek justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gage. Next we'll hear from Jumana Musa, Amnesty International.
Hi. I actually am going to talk about Guantanamo and the sort of lesser talked about detainees and legal processes. I do want to start, though, by thanking the families of 9/11 victims. It's very humbling to sort of sit on a panel and share this space, because I cannot imagine sort of the enormity of being attached to this sort of iconic U.S. image, but have it mean to be so personal to you. And so I'm thankful that you all are here and continuing to press our country and our government to look at these issues and to provide true security for all of us. I do want to start by saying that the attacks for September 11th, like the attacks in Bali, in Madrid, in London, and the almost daily attacks in Iraq, are crimes against humanity. There's no political cause or religious interpretation that can justify such indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations. The perpetrators of these types of attacks should certainly be brought to justice. The issue that we have is that this process must respect human rights and the rule of law. And this is not something that we've seen so far. I'm going to go back to the recommendation that Mr. Smith had read earlier, where they talked about customary international law and Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions providing a basis for treatment of detainees. And one of the passages in it says, "The passing of sentences and the carrying out of executions without previous judgment pronounced by a regularly constituted court affording all judicial guarantees which are recognized as indispensable by civilized people is prohibited." What we are seeing in Guantanamo is exactly the efforts to pass those types of sentences and carrying out of executions, completely outside of any legally recognized or regularly constituted court. We've already heard about the allegations of torture and ill treatment in U.S. custody. It's been well documented in Guantanamo, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in other nations that the U.S. has rendered people to, for a little bit of outsourcing of their torture and ill treatment. We've also seen some government investigations which always seem to sort of end with a wink and a nod and say, we know this guy was in charge, we know he was in charge in Guantanamo, he may have been in charge in Iraq. The investigators might have said that, hey, we should probably sanction this guy, but we're going to let him go. And for all we know, he might get promoted in the future. It seems to be pattern and practice with this government that rather than sanction the people who are involved in writing these policies, instituting these practices, they tend to get let off the hook and promoted. And I think the reason that Guantanamo is so important, not because it is the one place in the world where the worst human rights abuses are occurring, but it's certainly the most visible manifestation of the U.S. administration's refusal to uphold human rights and the rule of law. When it came time to set up military commissions in Guantanamo Bay to try people for war crimes, The U.S., rather than looking at any kind of established justice system, went off of a presidential order written in November of 2001 and essentially chose to reach back to a couple of Supreme Court cases from around World War I and World War II and say we can create these military commissions and ignore the following 50-plus years of developments in federal law, in international law, and in military justice. And in doing so, they came up with these commissions, which these commissions are basically made up of the rules and the instructions that are put up on the Defense Department's website. Just a body of instructions and orders that go up that could change any time. At the outset, though, I do want to let you know that the problems that I'm about to detail with the military commissions are issues with the way in which they're constructed. It's not a reflection on the men and women who are assigned to the Office of Military Counsel, who are doing their best to work within the system they have, and they have some very good people there. So I do want to separate that out because this is not an issue of personalities. This is an issue of the system and the folks who created it. I'm going to go through 4 fundamental problems, although there's a great deal more. It's something that could be talked about all day, but I think it's just easy to look at just from these 4 why these commissions are so problematic. And I do remember sitting in one of the sessions and one of the journalists said to me, well, I'm not a lawyer, what should I be looking for today? And my response to her was, you don't need to be an attorney to see the problems with these commissions. She agreed with me later. The first thing I'll say is that they're absolutely discriminatory. I think it was laying out quite nicely the difference you might encounter if you're John Walker Lindh versus Yasser Hamdi, or if you bomb Oklahoma City or are picked up at O'Hare Airport, and the arbitrary nature of that. But the President's order sets out that this order is for non-citizens. So if you are John Walker Lindh and you are picked up in Afghanistan with plenty of the folks who are currently in Guantanamo, you go to the U.S., you get federal court, you get the rights inherent with that. If you're not a U.S. citizen, you get thrown in Guantanamo and you get the rules we put up on the website. In addition, we've also seen close allies of the U.S. negotiating on behalf of their citizens. So if you're an Australian like David Hicks, you're charged before the military commissions. Your government seems to think they're A-OK in terms of a system of justice, but they said, hey, if he's going to have to serve time, he should get to come home to Australia. If you're from Yemen or from Sudan and your government doesn't have that kind of relationship with the U.S., you're stuck in Guantanamo. If you're British and you're identified as eligible for trial before the military commission, and your government, who's close to the United States, raises the stink and says, absolutely no way, we won't allow our citizens to be tried before these military commissions unless they're brought in line with fair trial standards. Well, earlier this year, the U.S. quietly released those 2 detainees, sent them back to Britain without trying them or charging, which is all but an admission that they refused to bring these military commissions in line with fair trial standards. So the bottom line is if you're from a country that can't or won't negotiate with the U.S. government, you're out of luck. The second problem, the military commissions have exactly one rule of evidence, which is it can admit evidence that is, quote, probative to the reasonable person, which could be just about anything that's not completely unrelated, which means it can admit hearsay evidence, and more significantly, you can admit evidence that's obtained by torture. I think it's been well documented that evidence obtained by torture is extremely unreliable, but more importantly, it's illegal. It's illegal under Article 15 of the Convention Against Torture, which the U.S. has signed and ratified, which reads, each state party shall ensure that any statement which is established to have been made as a result of torture shall not be invoked as evidence in any proceedings. Period. However, as we know, this administration has seemed to take a pick-and-choose approach to international law as well as domestic law, and I think they chose to ignore that one. I think that's also particularly troubling when you take it with my third point, which is that the accused can be excluded from their proceedings. And when I say excluded, some people have the notion just excluded from classified portions, which can be problematic, and there's been plenty of ways of dealing with classified information in the U.S. system and how to keep the accused abreast of what's happening. But within the military commission, the accused can be excluded, and although his detailed military defense counsel can stay there, he cannot share anything that he learns with the accused. And when they say protected information, like I said, much broader than confidential or classified information, which could include everything from classified or classifiable evidence, information protected by law or rule from unauthorized disclosure, the physical safety of participants in commission proceedings, including prospective witnesses, intelligence and law enforcement sources, methods or activities, and then the catch-all, and other national security interests. So they have a broad brush as to what they can actually exclude people from, and not just, again, exclude the accused, not give him a summary, and not allow his attorney to tell him what happened. So if you take that in conjunction with a rule that says they can admit hearsay, they can admit evidence obtained by torture, you can actually end up with a system whereby the accused the accused will be excluded from proceedings where an anonymous witness is presenting hearsay evidence that may have been obtained by torture, where there's no record of the initial interrogation, or even the ability to check if it's translated properly, and that testimony can convict him and even sentence him to death. What's even more troubling after you get through all of this is once there's a decision made by these military commissions, there's absolutely no independent review whatsoever. The review stays completely within the executive. The commission decision goes to the appointing authority. There is this little review panel that was selected personally by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, which can give an advisory opinion, but then the decision goes back to the President and the Secretary of Defense, who approved the charges in the first place. It's a very circular system, it's hermetically sealed, and it's really meant to prevent any kind of outside review of these decisions or these processes. So you essentially have the system which was created by a presidential edict and can be altered at any time at the whim of the executive. And when you look at it in that sense, an independent appeal is more needed than ever. And these are just a few of the problems. I mean, I could go through the issues with the panel, non-lawyers acting as judges and juries all at once. The idea that this is a legal system in and of itself, and the fact that they've put out phrases that people are, they're innocent until proven guilty, and this will be full and fair. However, everyone facing trial by military commission has already been deemed to be an enemy combatant, which has had an ever-changing definition, but from what the President and other administration officials have told us, that means that they're the worst of the worst and very bad people, and therefore somehow deserving of no particular rights. And then sort of just the kicker to all of this is that within the President's order, they make it clear that nobody in Guantanamo is subject to any law except for the ones that they choose to bestow on them, whatever rights they choose to bestow. They say within the order that with respect to any individual subject to this order, that military tribunals shall have exclusive jurisdiction. The individual shall not be privileged to seek any remedy or maintain any proceeding directly or indirectly, to have any such remedy or proceeding sought on the individual's behalf in any court of the United States or any state thereof, or any court of a foreign nation or any international tribunal. So should there be any confusion by the idea that they are seeking to act unilaterally outside of the law, they put it in black and white. I think this certainly promotes the direction that we've seen this administration take, which is pursuit of unfettered executive power. It's one of the things I saw today, it was a little disturbing. Someone sent me a website. Apparently Rush Limbaugh now has a whole series of Club Gitmo accessories that you can buy. And you can take your picture in them, send them to his website. And one of the things on the Club Gitmo t-shirts, you can get one with a phrase on the back that says, "What happens in Gitmo stays in Gitmo." The issue here is, of course, that's certainly not true. The United States, as the world's sole superpower, has the ability to either raise or lower the bar when it comes to individual rights, human rights, and the rule of law. And in this instance, it's lowering the bar. I've witnessed this sort of parody of justice that's been happening in Guantanamo, and there's no gratuitous references of full and fair that are going to make it any more full and fair. If the process wouldn't be deemed acceptable for U.S. citizens, it shouldn't be acceptable for citizens of Australia, Yemen, Sudan, or Canada. And so I think if they were to go along with the Commission's recommendation on this one, they would scrap the commissions, they would go back to a recognized tribunal or court, whether it's court-martial, U.S. court, etc.
Thank you. Ms. Musa, thank you very much. Thank you. We're moving on to civil liberties and American post-911. Is security worth the trade? And Mary Rose Olkar will be speaking.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to compliment all the panelists. I'm really so taken by all the remarks, and it's very instructive, and that is why this hearing is so important. And I want to congratulate Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, because it has been now that I'm an observer of Congress and not a member, I don't see this side of the story at hearings whatsoever. So I'm delighted that you are having this, and hopefully the American people will have another point of view and diverse opinions about what's going on not only in our country but throughout the world. I do represent the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, which is 25 years old, fighting for civil rights. And, of course, we condemn terror attacks. We advocate the Dr. Martin Luther King philosophy. The Arab American, Muslim, and South Asian communities have faced extraordinary difficulties in the days, weeks, and months following the terrorist attacks of September 11th. The anxiety, the fear created in the community, and the hate crimes. And I did bring with me, which is part of the congressional record, our report on hate crimes since 9/11. If anybody wants a copy, we'll be happy to send it to you. And discrimination that was compounded by serious civil liberties concerns regarding aspects of the investigation into the terrorist attacks and the new Homeland Security policies and regulations. Of course, the atmosphere has been exacerbated by the campaign in American popular culture of racial profiling. Some members of the media, including who you just mentioned, and some elected officials for the vicious defamation and vilification against Arabs, Islam, and anybody who's perceived to be. Just the other day, a member of Congress, if I can believe this, indicated that a possible solution to certain terrorist attacks could be to nuke Mecca. This type of inflammatory rhetoric only feeds fuel to the fire, because you can be sure that his words were broadcast throughout the more than 1.3 billion Muslims throughout the world. Certainly there's been administrative policies and actions taken by the executive branch, and frankly some laws that Congress passed which have served to curb our rights and due process, undermine fundamental constitutional protections, and profile communities and target them for heightened scrutiny. And we believe as Arab Americans that when you protect one group, you are protecting the civil rights of all people, not only in this country but hopefully throughout the world. The targeting has focused on the Arab and Muslim communities and includes, among measures, detentions, and some of this is mentioned, but I think it bears repetition since you don't hear it very often in these halls. Detentions without charges, closed hearings, interviews of Arab and Muslim men by various members of law enforcement, a form of ethnic and racial profiling, especially in October right before the election. It seemed to increase a little bit. Secrecy regarding immigration detainees, and the registration and monitoring of Arab males under a very controversial and discriminatory program called the National Security Entry Exit Registration System, NSERS, and also known as the Special Registration Program. This program aimed exclusively at any male between certain ages, above 16, I believe, to 45, of individuals coming to our country on visas, like students, like people who want to go to the Cleveland Clinic in my hometown, etc., or even to Disneyland. And it included only Arab men, and with the exception of North Korea, and of course, as you know, not many people come from North Korea. These men were required to register, fingerprinted, photographed with local immigration offices by a specified deadline. Some of them never got notice of this because it happened after 2002, and were required to register at designated ports of departure prior to leaving. When they first started Homeland Security, as an example, and I think anecdotal examples are, so you put a face to some of this, there were 40 students that came from one of the Arab countries, and they were leaving. And you're required, if you're an Arab male, to register out. They were leaving because they were on a summer break from school. They were all seniors in college. And nobody was at the office at Dulles Airport for Homeland Security, which was supposed to be open from 9 to 4 or something like that. So these young men thought, well, they're not open, so I guess it's okay to leave because their flight was that night. Well, they left, and now they can't come back to this country because they failed to register. And we are trying very hard to get them grandfathered, since it wasn't their fault that the office was not open, even though it was supposed to be open. Now, some of these registration requirements are eliminated, but we still have some of those registration requirements, again targeting one group of people. However, now we have the U.S., I can't understand why this program still exists, is now we have the U.S. Visit Program, which covers visa holders throughout the world. So why do you now have to target Arab men or people from North Korea? While the program was advertised as a national security tool, it proved to be an ineffective tool of law enforcement, a waste of valuable resources. No terrorists were apprehended, not one, as a result of this failed program called NSEERS. Certainly there's no greater responsibility of government today than to work to prevent future terrorist attacks. But instead of focused in effective law enforcement investigation, the government turned to broad measures that threaten basic rights and indeed enhance the whole quality of our constitutional rights. Hundreds, I could give you all kinds of examples. We get 350 cases every week that people call us in our national office and other offices across the country. Hundreds have been jailed for months and years when it appears without the government openly giving evidence linking them to terrorism. Many of these detained have been held incommunicado, no right to an attorney. We're talking about some of whom happen to be Americans. I'll give you one example which might surprise you. There was a Catholic nun who went to the immigration office in my state of Ohio and was going to file and take the test, to become an American citizen, etc. And all of a sudden, she went alone, unfortunately, and English is her second language. And she went alone, and she was whisked away to jail. And she had no idea why they did this to her. Nobody told her anything. She was in jail for 3 weeks. Nobody knew where she was. And finally, she said, well, send me back to, she happened to be Lebanese, she said, send me back to Lebanon, and they wouldn't do anything. Can I call my family? No. Can I talk to an attorney? No. Finally, she threatened to commit suicide. And when she did that, they let her go back to the parish where she was working. That does happen in this great country of ours. Even when the government selectively targeted thousands of Arab and Muslim men for voluntary interviews, federal terrorism investigators continued to insist that none of the 8,000 men targeted were terrorist suspects. Investigators also publicly acknowledged that they had no reason to believe that those selected for interviews had any useful knowledge regarding terrorist activities. Thus, these interviews were driven by the interviewees' ethnicity, gender, and countries of origin, and sometimes religion. Many of these people were interviewed, by the way, at their jobs. Now, even if the law enforcement agencies said they did nothing wrong, they're free, we just wanted to question them, many of these people lost their jobs, and as a result there is terrific employment discrimination. We have examples such as an airline pilot who happened to be Arab American and worked for the company for 19 years, and an impeccable record. They laid him off, gave no reason. We finally interceded, and the EEOC did a good job. He's back on the job, but everybody now has a wonder about this guy. So you can imagine what that is like, not only humiliating, but threatens their economic security. The country's experiences with terrorism demonstrate the ineffectiveness of using religious or racial markers or as keys to finding terrorist suspects, both potential and actual. Americans of non-Arab descent, such as John Walker Lynn and Jose Padilla, Richard Reed, British national of English and Jamaican heritage, are examples of how neither ethnicity nor national origin are consistent characteristics of al-Qaeda operatives. Then, of course, there's Timothy McVeigh, who committed the second worst terrorist act, and I don't believe we racially profiled blonde-haired, blue-eyed American men. We believe the 9/11 attacks on our nation require some reconsideration of the balance between security and liberty. We understand the need to have increased security. Arab Americans died in 9/11. Firefighters who happen to be Arab died in 9/11. I mean, we all feel it's abhorrent for anyone to lose their life or their security. Just one last thing. The bad law enforcement does not make us safer. We need to be mindful of what the 9/11 Commission stated, which is one thing I agreed with at least, regarding the protections of civil liberties. While protecting our homeland, Americans should be mindful of threats to vital personal and civil liberties. This balancing is no easy task, but we must strive to keep it right. And I certainly hope we do. And this hearing is going to be important. I'd like to submit some more material for your record, Madam Chair. Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Ms. Okar. Next, we'll hear from Elaine Cassell.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for allowing me to be here. And I'm just so caught up in all these presentations and remarks. I keep making notes, and I want to talk about this and that, but I'm going to stick with what I prepared. And I appreciate the Representative McKinney's staff giving me the task of doing something very specific today, because I have ranted and raved for the past 4 years, and you can find many of my rantings and ravings online in articles that I've written about many of the so-called terrorist prosecutions. Many of the cases everyone has spoken about here, I have written about them in one way or the other. But when I was asked to focus on a specific recommendation of the 9/11 panel and then make a recommendation of my own, that made me have to stand back and try to be a little bit sane and sensible and figure out, okay, what could I find that I could make specific recommendations about. And I found something, and so my remarks are mainly directed at the Congress, and I hope that as they find their way in the record and with Congresswoman McKinney and others, that this might be taken to heart and you might find it useful. So, following up on what Mary talked about, civil liberties post 9/11, is security worth the trade? My answer is, I don't know. It depends. Not based so far on the convictions and the detentions that I've written about and that you've heard about this afternoon, and the practices that I have witnessed daily and that we all witness daily. And I'm not convinced that there has to be a trade-off between the constitutionally based liberties of everyday law-abiding Americans and protecting us from the evils of terrorist and terrorism. For instance, to use an example that we've talked about in terms of Richard Reed, I don't think it has been proven or shown to be reasonable that having everyone boarding an airplane and taking off their shoes because Richard Reed tried to set his shoe on fire is keeping us safer. Now, that's a small thing. And of course, we've gotten used to it. It's not a terrible intrusion, but what's it all about? Does it make any sense? There was a specific recommendation of the 9/11 panel, recommendation number 41, page 428. The Department of Homeland Security, and I'm quoting, and its oversight committees should regularly assess the types of threats the country faces to determine, A, the adequacy of the government's plans and the progress against those plans to protect America's critical infrastructure, and B, the readiness of the government to respond to the threats that the United States might face. Now, and I have some specific recommendations, but first of all, you hear President Bush and former Attorney General Ashcroft and now Attorney General Gonzalez talk about how all these so-called terrorist prosecutions that they've been successful at locking people up, sometimes for life, are making us safer and making the world safer. But you read closer those cases and read some of the indictments, and you'll find that they weren't nearly about what you are led to think they are about. And it's highly questionable whether what the people were convicted of doing even constituted terrorism. As Kit mentioned, well, you can find hundreds of definitions of terrorism, but the one that most of us can accept as reasonable, that is using violence to target civilians for the purpose of political gain, is what we all should be interested in. I think that's what the 9/11 Commission was interested in addressing. So I recommend that the Congress put the emphasis on the assess and adequacy part of this recommendation and require that the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the CIA, and every other agency that says it has to violate restrictions on government power required by the Bill of Rights, I ask the Congress to hold these agencies accountable by requiring the following: that the agencies show what they have done to appropriately assess terrorist threats from all manner of sources. Number two, that they be required to identify and quantify, insofar as possible, what these threats are. As Mary just spoke about, rounding up thousands of Muslims after September 11th and detaining them for months in the Manhattan Detention Center did not net one charge of terrorism. Registration of Muslim men, as she talked about, did nothing except humiliate and terrify not just Muslims, but Americans like all of us here. Number three, prioritize these threats in order of the greatest harm to the greatest number of people or to the greatest resources, such as our air, our water, our energy system, financial markets, and of course, huge targets, big important targets for our health and safety. Number four, develop intelligence, non-politicized intelligence, if that's possible, and prevention and intervention strategies that are commensurate with the risk. Number five, demonstrate why Americans must suffer this or that specific erosion of liberty in order to address this particular threat or threats. In other words, prove the efficacy of the intervention and prove to us with rational facts and challengeable evidence that the trade-off is worth it. Prove that the interventions chosen are the least harmful to our freedoms, and I use a term from mental health law, the least restrictive alternative that is acceptable under the circumstances in order to be effective for the targeted prevention or intervention. Number seven, do not, under any circumstance, trust what the executive branch tells you, but demand verification from outside experts that the threats and remedies claimed are real. Now, we know that this administration is masterful at disinformation, misinformation, red herrings, but as I hear and I listen, and adore C-SPAN. So to C-SPAN who's here today, I say thank you. Whenever I'm in the car, I've always got C-SPAN on listening to hearings, and it just kills me to hear the administration refuse to answer, or I'll have to get back to you on that. And you wonder, how often do they really get back to you on that? Number 8, require, as all good assessments and interventions require, that the agencies periodically review their programs and interventions against verifiable results showing that the actions taken, including those that have eroded specific liberties, are yielding sufficient results that make security worth the trade. And if they're not, then change the programs. That's right. And finally, in order to make this happen, hold the budgets hostage for the receipt of this information, because we know that's the only thing that matters to this, to the executive branch, is that they get the money to do what they want to do. But until they answer the questions and until those answers are verifiable and demonstrated, then don't give them the money. And I realize, I was talking to another member of the panel, that representatives and senators who do that are going to be accused of being soft on terrorism, and Karl Rove's going to make fun of you and all of that. But you're going to have to stand up to this, because we're not going to have anything left if you don't. 4 years since September 11th, almost 4 years, and 1 year since the 9/11 Commission's report, critical infrastructures and resources are unprotected, and protections are unplanned, as far as I know. Co-chair of the panel, Lee Hamilton, mentioned that this morning in a press briefing. He was very frustrated by that, and he mentioned that these are difficult tasks to take on. And I noted, thinking about what I was going to say, that, yeah, it's easy to search every airline passenger and every person who's on the mall for the 4th of July fireworks. That's easy. All you got to do is pay triple overtime and, let everyone stand in line for hours. But it's hard to try to assess the risk to our critical infrastructure and to intervene in prevention. But this country is full of brilliant people who can get to that task of trying to figure out how to do that. It's easy to open a file on demonstrators against the administration's policies and conduct surveillance on the ACLU and Greenpeace, as the Washington Post reported last week. I seriously doubt that the ACLU and Greenpeace are terrorist organizations. In fact, if they were, the government would have shut them down. So why are we paying the FBI's counterterrorism unit to amass thousands of files on these organizations and individuals? In addition to that, in that same report, the Washington Post reported about the hundreds of files that were kept on protesters at the Republican National Convention. The 9/11 Commission says that the threat of terrorism comes from Islamist extremists. I was listening to some speakers earlier this morning, or earlier this afternoon, and the speakers today challenged that conclusion. So we have to find out. And as Kit mentioned, and others have mentioned, the threat of terrorism is from many sources. That's why we have to identify and assess where the greatest risks are. For instance, the FBI has been able to assess risk, and we've enacted laws to protect abortion clinics. And people who bomb abortion clinics and kill abortion doctors, one, pled guilty just recently. That's something, again, that the criminal justice system can identify, can conduct surveillance on, and can address. The agencies charged with protecting us should address their resources for assessment and creating verifiable methods in order to identify the risk. They can use, for instance, models that are already used by behavioral scientists, have been used, say, for instance, by the FBI in conducting and creating a model for identifying potential school killers. The FBI has done some wonderful work with many behavioral scientists, and they have about a 100-page study of how you can identify where there are, what specific types of children, for instance, exhibiting specific types of behavior might need certain interventions in order to protect them and the rest of the children in school. So this is doable. We have spent billions, even trillions of dollars on homeland security since 9/11, much of it wasted or unaccounted for. June 30, 2005, Washington Post headline, "The high cost of the rush to security. TSA lost control of over $300 million spent by contractors to hire airport screeners." $300 million lost. July 19th, $15 million to barricade the Lincoln Memorial. Is there data to back up these expenditures, that blocking off the memorials protect us against real threat? I can hardly bear the irony of having to pass through security at the Jefferson Memorial, so I refuse to do it. In reading the article about the Lincoln Memorial, my 11-year-old grandson, with whom I had a visit on the mall recently, suggested that, quote, if we, meaning us, can't get to it, they, I think meaning the government, may as well tear it down. I think he has a point. All federal agencies receiving Homeland Security funds should be held accountable for how they're spending it and should prove to us that they're spending it in order to make us safer. And I want to quote from the House Minority Leader Pelosi, who yesterday, in calling for continued debate about the Patriot Act, said, referring to the Congress, quote, we have a duty to protect the American people from terrorism, but also to protect law-abiding American citizens from unaccountable and unchallengeable government power over their personal lives.
Ms. Cassell, your statement can be submitted to the record. We're running out of time.
And I just encourage the Congress to heed her challenge, and then we'll know whether the trade-off is worth it.
Thank you. Elaine Cassell. These proceedings are currently being streamed online at www.pacifica.com. We want everyone who's listening to know that we are in a briefing on the 911 Commission report, and that this briefing, it was convened by Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. We're in the caucus room at the Cannon House office building, room 345. We are now moving on to the rise of secrecy after 9/11, and we will hear from Rebecca Daughtry. Ms. Daughtry?
Thank you very much. I'm Rebecca Daughtry, and I'm the FOI Service Center Director at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And I'm very grateful to be here. I think that that secrecy is so much of a part of the dialogue on the events of 9/11 and what we've seen happening since 9/11. At the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, we're concerned with increasing government secrecy every day. The findings of the 911 Commission were that government secrecy prior to the tragedy was so pervasive that the failure of government agencies to share information may have contributed to the failure of our government to detect and prevent those events. This wasn't the first of the tragedies in our lifetime found in retrospect to have been exacerbated by secrecy. Although the government had committed no evil acts in its handling of the 1993 raid on the Branch Davidian compound at Waco, its failure to be candid with the public caused untold damage and many events to occur afterward. This was found by Special Counsel, former Senator John Danforth, who did a long study of what had happened at Waco and afterwards. He noted that inexplicable government secrecy about the use of pyrotechnic devices at Waco, uses found not to have ignited the tragic fires that consumed the compound, was something that everyone thought about and no one knew the truth about, and even though the government may have in his investigation done no wrong, its bunker mentality gave the public all over the country the idea that it had. The 911 Commission wrote at some length about the failure of the government prior to 911 to share information between agencies, but it also acknowledged that the national news media had nothing to report. The secrecy that occurred before 9/11 was so pervasive that information was just withheld. The Commission found that the events of 9/11 were a shock, but should not have been a surprise. They were preceded by a decade of rapidly escalating Islamic terrorism, of attacks foiled and of less successful attacks. The system, the report said, was blinking red. There were many indicators that bin Laden was planning something big. But those indicators never got the attention in the media that would give the public any idea of the breadth of the escalating problem. The fears of the millennium changes, where the government worked regularly with the news media to make the public aware of the dangers that could occur as a system designed for one century would be called upon to be used in the next century, were well The media communicated to the public, and we were all ready. This certainly didn't happen with the events of 9/11. The Commission found that 9/11 was preceded by the failures of imagination, with too few minds devoted to the consideration of too few facts. Islamic terrorism was simply not a matter of vigorous and informed debate among the public, the media, or Congress. So it's a major irony that a tragedy that in retrospect is attributable in pertinent part to secrecy has spawned incredible new efforts by the federal and state governments to keep even more information secret. Virtually every state has either adopted or proposed new secrets as a result of the events of 9/11. For the most part, these have to do with keeping secret vulnerabilities in the infrastructure. The 9/11 Commission found that 85% of the critical infrastructure is privately owned, but there's government oversight of most of it, of the transportation system, of the communication system, of water and lights, dams, and bridges. In the bunker mentality we saw after Waco, the government has tried hard to make weaknesses secret. Here there's a thought that if the infrastructure is weak, has weaknesses, then it will be vulnerable to terrorists. And if they know of the weaknesses, they will be able to capitalize on them. But far scarier is the thought, I think, that the infrastructure could be secretly weak. If no one knows of the weaknesses, who is going to demand that it be made stronger? We've heard the government attorneys refer to alphabet soup of new labels for government information: SBU, sensitive but unclassified; FOUO, for official use only; SSI, sensitive security information, etc., etc. Clearly, those labels are not intended to displace the disclosure requirements of the Freedom of Information Act, but we believe that many in the federal workforce believe that they do, that information that does not fall within one of the 9 exemptions to the Act can be protected simply because it bears a protective label. In addition, information on vulnerabilities that's been available on federal websites has been removed, even where public notification is required, as by the Clean Air Act. This month, the Environmental Protection Agency gave OMB Watch the risk management plans filed by chemical plants, which notify communities what risks exist and what they are doing to protect against worst-case scenarios. The delivery of that information only came after OMB Watch filed a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. It didn't come as a result of its requests. We've seen the executive order on classification changed after 9/11 to permit reclassification of records. It provides for new categories of information to be classified: infrastructure vulnerabilities or capabilities, protection services relating to national security, and weapons of mass destruction. And now it gives the director of the Central Intelligence Agency the power to block declassification decisions by the Interagency Security Classification Appeals Panel. In addition, we've seen new information protected from disclosure by agency policies, which have been upheld by the courts. In Living Rivers, a 2003 case in a U.S. District Court in Salt Lake City, allowed the law enforcement maps of flood areas below Hoover and Glen Canyon dams to be withheld because it might be of use to terrorists to know where the floodwaters would go if the dam burst. That information would also be very useful to the people who lived in what was anticipated as the flow. And yet, because terrorists might use that information, it couldn't be made available to the public that lived in that area or anyplace else. The U.S. Court of Appeals D.C. Circuit and Center for National Security Studies versus Department of Justice allows the government to keep secret the names of all of the detainees domestically that were held for months and months and months. We can get a spreadsheet on those detainees. We can see what they were accused of, whether they were let go, and so forth, but we don't know who they are. I would tell you that we know very little about who was held if we don't know who they are. And no spreadsheet is going to give us any kind of a picture about what happens with detainees. In another case, the U.S. District Court in Los Angeles allowed the U.S. Customs Service to protect internal documents on the inspections of seaport operations. Where were you most likely to be able to get by customs? Because terrorists could learn how often inspections occurred and send their containers to vulnerable ports. Well, I would wager that we want to know also where those vulnerable ports are and to do something about them. The decision meant that the public could exercise no oversight over the way in which the government conducts these inspections, if it does conduct those inspections. The Reporters Committee certainly empathizes with the need to protect this country in different ways in the wake of 9/11. However, we believe that the greater protection comes from better and more widely dispersed knowledge, and that, certainly with exceptions where disclosures could clearly compromise national security, a public that is better informed is safer and better able to protect itself in the future, not only from terrorists, but from the dark underside of activity kept secret when sunshine could and should have illuminated it. And we appreciate your interest in our views. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Daughtry. Next, we will go into the Patriot Act, Sunset on Freedom, and we'll have William Michaels, our last speaker.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's actually C. William Michaels. There's a typo in the program, but the nameplate is correct. Timekeeper, I think I was scheduled for 15 minutes, but I'll intend to be less than that, but you'll let me know, I'm sure. Thank you. I'm honored to be on this program of very impressive people who represent much of the serious thinking and acting that has been going on about these issues. I thank Representative Cynthia McKinney's office and the organizers of this event for their efforts and for their invitation. I am presenting last, so I will try to be as concise as possible, which hopefully also means as brief as possible. The topic is Sunset or Freedom. In October 2001, as the USA Patriot Act was moving quickly through Congress, concern was expressed inside and outside the Hill over several of the quite dramatic sections in Title II of the bill. Among these were greatly expanded investigation and surveillance authorities under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, increased duration of FISA warrants, authorization for the first time in a federal statute of non-physical search warrants, commonly known as sneak and peek warrants, combined with a provision allowing for delayed notification of execution of these warrants for a reasonable period, permission for FBI access to any tangible thing in a terrorism investigation through a court order, which a court must sign if the FBI's application for the order meets stated requirements, and nationwide service of search warrants. Wishing a strong showing for the bill, the Bush administration and some in the congressional leadership, I have no specific names to note, which would be a detour at this point anyway, offered to include a 4-year sunset or expiration provision for many of these sections. Given the wide vote margins in both houses on the final bill, 357 to 66 in the House and 98 to 1 in the Senate, negotiations of this sort seem in retrospect perhaps to have been unnecessary. But there were concerns to be addressed, and it seemed this approach addressed them. Keep in mind that sunset provisions occur only in Title II of the statute. There are no sunset provisions in any other of the 10 titles of the Patriot Act. There was a provision allowing Congress by joint resolution to invalidate all of Title III, which includes terrorist financing investigations. But that provision was repealed by the 2004 Intelligence Reform Act, thus making Title III permanent. When the Patriot Act was signed, October 26, the prevailing understanding among many in Congress and certainly among the public was that these Title II provisions would expire at the end of 2005 as declared in the law. Many observers, however, and I count myself among them only to mention that more astute people than I called attention to this, remarked that this sunset deal was not likely to last. And sure enough, By the time of the State of the Union address in 2003, following the midterm elections, the administration announced its intention to ask Congress to renew the Patriot Act. Of course, the Patriot Act did not need renewing. What that term referred to was a repeal of the sunset provisions of those Title II sections set to expire, thus making them as permanent as the rest of the statute. This theme of renewing the Patriot Act was repeated throughout 2003 in statements by then Attorney General John Ashcroft and by other administration figures. It became a specific theme in the 2004 State of the Union address as well as throughout the presidential campaign. Here in mid-2005, Congress is about to do just that. Patriot Act reauthorization legislation, which would renew most, if not all, of these Title II sections, is moving through the House. The number of Title II sections to be renewed might vary depending on how current amendments fare in the final bill, and given that action on the Senate bill is still to be completed. And a real brief outline of some of that material is in a Washington Post article, today's Post. We are here to consider this development in light of the 9/11 Commission recommendations. It is important to note that very little of what Title II of the Patriot Act does is reflected in those recommendations. Many of them, incorporated in the 2004 Intelligence Reform Act, are reflected in that statute. Other recommendations on things as national standards for driver's licenses, of course, are in the Real ID Act. To the extent the 9/11 Commission recommendations address emergency responders, increased border screenings, use of biometrics in passports, and the like, these matters can be found in Patriot Act Title IV, Title V. One or two recommendations involving the scope and extent of information sharing and privacy protection relate in general to Title II and Title VII. Other recommendations could relate to other laws like the Homeland Security Act or the Transportation Security Act. In any event, the 9/11 recommendations are not specifically directed to the Patriot Act. Nevertheless, unquestionably increased attention to Homeland Security brought about by these recommendations, further propelled by additional statutes such as the Homeland Security Act, Intelligence Reform Act, and Real ID Act, form the background of congressional interest in responding to the administration's call to renew the Patriot Act. So it is that when the current congressional activity on the Patriot Act is completed, it is likely that not one of the Patriot Act Title II sections scheduled to sunset in December 31st, 2005 will actually expire. Whether this means the administration and Congress never intended to keep to their ends of the sunset deal would be an interesting debate. Perhaps we'll read about that someday in John Ashcroft's memoirs. Whatever winking may have gone on, and I'm not suggesting that it did, we will now be faced with a Patriot Act that will be in all respects entirely permanent. Surely this situation is a grave disappointment to those of us who believe that Title II sunset language meant what it said. I do not doubt that everyone is acting in what they believe to be in the best interest of their country in a time of great national apprehension over the threat of terrorism and the firm desire to do everything reasonably possible to prevent a repeat of the tragic and horrific 9/11 attacks. Since the Patriot Act, the bombings in Madrid and London and elsewhere demonstrate well enough that the threat remains quite real. Nevertheless, on the topic of the Patriot Act sunset on freedom, a few things about this renewal of the statute stand out, and I offer them for later discussion as I move on to my final points. The administration's contentions of what is or is not needed in the war on terrorism are going to continue to get a very favorable hearing in Congress for quite some time. For example, it appears that Section 215 will be renewed, even though information is sketchy as to how often that section has been used and whether it has yielded any valuable anti-terrorism information. For another example, the seizure and detention by the executive branch of foreign nationals suspected of terrorism, authorized under Sections 411 and 412, to date have not been used at all. Yet there was no serious discussion in Congress to repeal those sections. Title III of the Patriot Act remains a concern. We are here to note Title II sunset provisions, and so I will not get into Title III, which in any event is far too complex to describe in the limited time available. I will note, however, that it is the bulk of the Patriot Act language. I will note only that Title III, which rewrites federal banking law in many respects, authorizes information gathering through a process which functions as an administrative subpoena and has been considerably expanded through the newly broadened definitions of domestic financial institution, poses at least the same set of privacy and investigative powers concerns as does Title II. Involves information at least as sensitive to the American public as library and bookstore records, and has a broader scope. The Patriot Act remains a focal point of debate among Americans over the war on terrorism, even though actual details of the statute are not widely known by the public. Whether one is for or against the Patriot Act has become a political litmus test in our national lexicon, and will remain so even after the reauthorization bill is passed and Congress moves on to other things. We need to continue that debate in the greater interest of coming to terms with implication of these national security issues. Concerns over being soft on terrorism have resulted in a woefully attenuated effect in Congress of the impressive list of state legislatures, towns, municipalities, and other jurisdictions across the country which have passed resolutions or ordinances critical of the Patriot Act in one form or another. That number, which continues to grow, is now reaching 400. An astounding and unprecedented figure when one considers that at no time in recent history, at least that I can remember, has there been a broad coast-to-coast movement of town councils representing a wide political spectrum and many walks of life, taking time out to criticize a standing federal law. My belief was that when this resolutions movement reached the 200 figure, Congress would have no choice but to take notice. Yet we are nearly double that number, and Title II of the Patriot Act, far and away the motivation and focus of these resolutions, is about to be reauthorized in toto, if not in large part. We need to consider that conundrum. For me, it does not bode well for a true representative democracy. In the reauthorization debate, little significance has been attached to the fact that we have had the Patriot Act for nearly 4 years, but not one person has been arrested in the United States and charged with direct involvement or assistance in the September 11th attacks. No such person was identified even from the roundups, it's already been mentioned, immediately after the September 11th attacks and before the Patriot Act was enacted, of more than 1,000 suspects, mostly foreign nationals, many of them held for extended periods in places like the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York. I refer you to the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General's 2 reports on that overall situation and on the conditions of those held. Many reasons can be offered for this fact, among them the obvious reasons that those who were involved in the attacks are either overseas or already dead. Still, stronger demands by Congress could have been made for explanations from the administration of why we continue to need this entire statute, when investigation of the 9/11 attacks clearly was a major reason for enacting it. The same can be said, in fact, for the anthrax scare, which was gripping Washington and New York at the very time that the Patriot Act was being considered. With the reauthorized Patriot Act, we have a statute that emphasizes themes of surveillance, investigation, information sharing, cyber terrorism, and infrastructure, and which brings to bear approaches of expansion of executive power, reduced court involvement, increased secrecy, advent of new technologies, and a more direct merging of federal, state, and local law enforcement activity in terrorism investigations. These are themes that continue in other statutes and to the expense of a more comprehensive view of the terrorism threat. The Commission, to its credit, consistently noted the observation that terrorism is a tactic, not necessarily an end in itself. Finally, in the now quite familiar debate over whether we must trade security for civil liberties, as Elaine has suggested, I suggest that this is a good time once again to examine that assumption. There are unfortunate examples in our history, to be sure, but in no recent time has an administration so directly required the American public to trade civil liberties to this extent, to investigate criminal conspiracies of other types. I have heard the rationales. I still do not think the case has been made that civil liberties of any sort must be compromised so we can get to the bottom of what terrorist conspiracies may or may not be operating within the United States. All of this, plus the scope and approach of the 9/11 Commission recommendations, which deal with everything from the FBI, passports, driver's license, airline passengers, brings me to the final points. And that is the effect we may be seeing as these varied parallel developments, including, of course, the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, the situation of military commissions in Camp Delta at Guantanamo Bay, which continue to unfold as we dispense with the legal preliminaries, and U.S. citizens held as enemy combatants come to a single point. What should be considered as we continue with this national debate is what might be on the horizon at that point. And there's time for this conspiracy if you have it. Those wider considerations can be summed up in my 12 common characteristics of what can be called a national security state. And I appreciate their effort to try to get that up there. We do what we can. By that term, I do not necessarily invoke any particular historic example, but suggest in general a national government preoccupied by and defining itself through concepts of national security. I will close then by listing those 12 characteristics without comment in the hopes that they may serve to generate national discussion on the road down which we may be headed as we enact or reauthorize statute after statute and as we give further consideration to the 9/11 Commission's recommendation. And so here they are. 12 common characteristics of national security state. They're also available as handouts on the table. Number 1, visible increase in uniformed security personnel. Number 2, lack of civil accountability for the actions of law enforcement and security personnel. Number 3, reduced role of the judiciary and executive treatment of suspects. Number 4, secrecy of the ruling authority and momentum of the threat. Number 5, media in the service of the state. Number 6, public and national resources called to service against the security threat. Number 7, patriotism moving to nationalism. Number 8, lack of critical response by religious denominations. Number 9, wartime mentality and permanent war economy. Number 10, targeted individuals or groups. Number 11, direct attack against dissent. And number 12, increased surveillance of the citizenry.
Thank you. Thank you.
I thank you for your attention and look forward to your comments.
Thank you, C. William Michaels. C. William Michaels. Next, we will have questions, and we'll begin with Ray McGovern, then Wayne Matson, and Mike Rupert. One question apiece.
I'll make mine a small question. Peter Walker Lind was mentioned. I'm sorry, John Walker Lind. Yeah. I'm interested in how much is known about the fact that a young woman lawyer in the Justice Department was fired because she warned her superiors that if they violated FBI and Justice Department rules, that they couldn't really prosecute him the way they wanted to. And I think the outcome of that was that the reason that he plea bargained was in return for his not mentioning the torture that he went through, that they agreed to give him less than the full sentence they were pressing for. Can you elaborate on that, anyone?
I wrote about that case, and I know her personally. Her name is Jesselyn Radack, R-A-D-A-C-K, and I urge you to look up on the Internet and read about her. Actually, she was fired because she found out that the judge in the John Walker Lind case had ordered the Department of Justice to turn over any emails that it had between her and the FBI agents in the field in Afghanistan who questioned Mr. Lind. And she found out by inquiry that the Justice Department had turned over very few of the emails. And so she contacted the prosecutor in Alexandria herself and gave him the emails. And when her supervisors found out about it, they were furious. And they immediately wrote her up and told her she should seek other employment. Subsequently to that, she was employed. She was brilliant. One of the honors program students in the Justice Department and went to Yale, so she was a brilliant, mind. And the law firm that she went to, she had not been there very long when the FBI appeared at her law firm, a white-collar law firm in D.C., and said that they were conducting a criminal investigation of her, and they wanted her files and her computers and so on, and so she was fired from that. Subsequent to that time, what happened is that John Ashcroft filed a complaint against her with the state bars of which she is a member, and said that she should be disbarred or seriously disciplined for violating Justice Department confidentiality. In other words, because she had reported and then talked to the press, Newsweek, what had happened to her, she was accused of being unethical, which is pretty amazing. The case against her in Maryland has been dismissed, and so she can practice law there, but the case in the District of Columbia is pending and has been pending for 2 years. So while a case is open against her in any state, she cannot practice law in any state of the country. She has 3 children. She is the major support of her family, and she also suffers from multiple sclerosis. She's a real victim in the Bush administration's war on the truth.
And that's our Department of Justice.
Yes.
I think actually just something to draw from that as well, though, that people should remember. I know there was a lot of shock amongst the American public when we saw the pictures from Abu Ghraib. The evidence of torture in U.S. custody far preceded that, and the pictures of John Walker Lynn stripped naked and taped to a stretcher were a clear indication of things to come. And so I think, as you correctly pointed out, part of his plea bargain is they were going to take all these death penalty offenses off the table if he agreed to never speak a word about the abuses he suffered in custody for the entire 20 years of his sentence. And I think that is just yet another way that the administration has kept the information about torture and ill treatment in custody from coming out. And so if I were to have a recommendation, it would be for another independent commission to look into those allegations, those policies, those practices, what prevented any type of oversight or investigation into the claims.
I'd like to say, too, that Jessalyn Raddick was our magazine cover story about that time, and I think she represents what is happening to government employees who talk to anyone. Her victimization really and whistleblowing did not come from a direct discussion with the press, although she was later able to tell her story. But we've seen terrible things happen to government employees who talk to the press. It's R-A-D-A-C-K, I believe.
Okay, thank you. We need to move on to the next questioner.
I want to thank Mr. McIlvaine for your very moving comments, and even with your personal tragic loss, you reminded me once again why our hometown is called, Philadelphia is called the city of brotherly love. So thank you again for your comments. On the foreign policy issue, for those who can address it, and this impacts on how we treat these so-called enemy combatants and detainees. We've seen basically the people who came up with the Project for a New American Century and all these other Heritage Foundation, AEI tracks, and all the other various groups out there, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. They've pretty much gotten what they've wanted. My question is, when we get rid of this mess that's running Washington, how long is it going to take, in your estimation, to try to get our foreign policy back to the status quo ante prior to 9/11? Because right now we see embryonic anti-U.S. strategic blocs forming, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes the Central Asian stands, China and Russia. So we're actually getting together the feared communist bloc that we were so much against in the Cold War. It's actually now, it was a fantasy then, but it's becoming fact now. And what's happening in Latin America, of course, from the hijacking of our Cuban policy by some fanatics in southern Florida, and also how we treat Venezuela and other countries. And again, this is repeated in Africa, the Southern Pacific, with our rejection of Kyoto, and our we're probably the most despised country on the planet right now. 25, 50 years, 100 years to try to get back to the status quo ante, in your estimation?
Could you repeat the question, please?
The damage.
How many years do you think it's going to take to get our foreign policy back to where where we did have respect for international law, the United Nations system, and bilateralism and multilateralism.
The damage. I was going to say, I think the damage is indeed great. The stature of the United States in many parts of the world has never been lower, never had less respect. Latin America is using this, as you suggest, to declare its independence of us. It might, however, not take so long. I think that this administration's foreign policy is such a disaster. It's so unethical, goes against so much that the United States has always stood for, that we may, over the next 3 years, see a dramatic reaction. That's my hope, that will get us back on track. It won't succeed in getting us back on track until this administration is out of office, but at least can begin to limit the damage done by this administration to foreign policy, to the ethics, our record for ethics in the world at large, and we can then, after this administration, quickly get back on track. That's my hope. You may be right. It may take 25, 30 or more years.
I'd like to add really also a footnote, something that struck me about an article I came across the other day on this enemy combatants business. We can get maybe, if time allows, some of the technicalities of how a person gets to be called an enemy combatant under the Geneva Convention and so on. But what I'm about to say is that what winds up becoming a matter of American law in the law books is pretty difficult to avoid over time. And in fact, administration is now calling into service Supreme Court cases dating back to the Civil War in terms of how it's going to treat enemy combatants in military tribunals. But nevertheless, what struck me, as I was about to say, is this Padilla case, where the Supreme Court, and although it didn't rule directly on Padilla, had mentioned in the Handy case that, well, Padilla probably is not going to make it as an enemy combatant because, after all, he wasn't seized on a battlefield. He was seized in Chicago O'Hare Airport. And then eventually, through a series of events, wound up as designated as an enemy combatant. Well, the article I came across said that during the hearing on this case, which I believe is now before the Fourth Circuit, government attorneys said that doesn't matter because the entire United States is now a battlefield. So it doesn't matter where we seize these people. We can declare that this country is now a battlefield, and therefore that distinction makes no difference. Now, if the Fourth Circuit buys that, and so far the Fourth Circuit has bought a lot, we may wind up with a reported decision as a matter of federal criminal law or federal constitutional law of how you become an enemy combatant even though you're a U.S. citizen, even though you were never seized in any kind of actual armed conflict. I don't know how many years it would take us to get out of that.
Can I respond? May I respond to you? I think if you look back to some of the egregious occurrences like the McCarthy hearings, the internment of Japanese, the manner in which we treated African Americans, etc., the McCarthy hearings and what happened is very, very instructive. And it was one of Senator McCarthy's own party, the only woman in the Senate, Senator Margaret Trace Smith, who stood up on the floor of the Senate and said, I am ashamed, I'm paraphrasing, of course, she was much more eloquent. She said, I am ashamed of my party. I am ashamed of these hearings. And it took many, many years, and of course she was the catalyst, in my judgment, from the little I know about it, in inspiring other Americans to stand up. And I remember, as a little kid, it was one of the few hearings that were first televised. And we had just gotten this television set, so my parents must have had it on. But I remember that speech. And how long did it take for the artists of the world, of our country, like Lillian Hellman, to get credibility? It took years, decades. I think it's imperative for people like Cynthia McKinney other members to follow her example and be courageous enough to have hearings right in this body to challenge whether they're Republicans or Democrats, and of course the Republicans control all the shots these days, but to challenge what's going on. And there are some moderate Republicans who are questioning what is going on with the aberration of the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So in my judgment, people who really want to make a difference, who are watching all this and so forth, have to let their members of Congress know, and the President know, who takes polls tens of polls every day. Let the people know that they are abhorred at what is going on with what is supposed to be the freest democracy in the world. And
Thank
so
you,
I think
panelists.
it's up to the hearings here.
Thank you. We'll move on to Mike Rupert.
This is going to be a difficult question for me, and I'm going to have to wind up beating up on my dear friend Cynthia McKinney because she's the only sitting member anywhere of the United States Congress who is in this room today. Why? We've heard some really, really disturbing things here today. Some things weren't even mentioned. I want to thank Mr. Michaels for referring to the fact that, 4 or 5 states and God knows how many cities now have passed resolutions opposing the Patriot Act. There was a word federal that had to do something with a respect for states and local governments that seems to disappear as we descend into empire here. The United States has thumbed its nose at the International Criminal Court at The Hague. We've basically told them, we don't care who you indict here, we're not going to let you talk to any of our people, and how do we expect the world to behave like that? It's very interesting that the Patriot Act was already drafted before the 9/11 attacks occurred. 9/11 is the watershed moment that has opened the door to everything else that has followed, and that's why it's so important to understand the significance of 9/11 above and beyond. Nobody mentioned total information awareness. And the absolute violation of any privacy we have with respect to all of our personal records and its attachment to Promise software, which is it's a matter of record that this software exists that can data mine every aspect of our lives on almost real-time basis. We've seen portions of the First, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments to the to the Constitution either abrogated totally or partially since 9/11. And where I have to hold Congress to blame is that there was a state of emergency declared on 9/11, and it is a statutory obligation of the Congress of the United States to meet after 60 days to review that state of emergency and grant the statutory authority for so many of the violations, especially with respect to the military tribunals, which have taken place overseas. And to my knowledge, Congress has not once met to even discuss that state of emergency. And this is why I am at a point. I mean, I've been walking these halls, and this is going to be a jump ball question. Like, I'm going to throw the basketball in the air, and I'll bet you it hits the ground because nobody wants to touch it. Okay? I've been walking these halls since 1979, and I first came to Congress looking for help because my life was in danger. That was a lot more real to me than some academic discussion. I was a whistleblower with LAPD. I needed help from Congress because I caught my government doing something wrong. I've been walking these hills every year since. And I'm sorry, but I see a descent, and you have described, if you will, a disease state of a republic, whatever you want to call it, descending. And this is a historical question for anybody who wants to take it. Any of you historians out there, have any of you ever seen a nation or an empire at the pinnacle of power, whether it be Rome, France, Spain, Britain, anywhere else, descend down a road to totalitarianism and on its own voluntarily decide to turn around? I, for one, am extremely skeptical, and this is the bravest woman on Capitol Hill of all the members I've ever met, sitting right up there. But I have to ask, there's a lot of Americans who are scared. There's a lot of Americans who don't buy what's going on. There's a lot of Americans who are worried their sons and daughters are going to be drafted. There's a lot of Americans who are going to be worried about we are waking up in a totalitarian state. And we're trying to throw them a bone here, which I don't see much meat on the bone we're throwing them today. So, historically, what hope do you have that we are going to be able to turn any of this around, and please do not give me or any of the American people a platitude response about we can write letters and have hearings and all this stuff. This is the only woman who's put her career, she's had a 2-year vacation and had to come back, okay, thanks to a lot of people in this room, okay. We want some action. How optimistic are you that we are going to do any of this?
Ms. Musa, could you begin to answer that?
In my book, I give ratings to these 12 characteristics of a national security state, and I'm working on a second edition that's going to be coming out soon, and where I revise those ratings, and the trend is not good. I do think we are at a watershed moment, and I don't say that to be dramatic, because cameras are on. I think this country has to really examine itself as to where it's going with all of this and roll all of this up into a ball. We focus a lot on the Patriot Act because it seems to be an iconic sort of statute nowadays. But there's so much that has been going on aside from it, and a lot of parallel developments that continue. If you roll all of that into a ball and roll it somewhere, where is it going? And I don't think it's going anywhere good. There are moments, and obviously September 11th was what I would call a galvanizing moment, but there are other instances in which we came very, very close and have dropped back. I think the McCarthyism of the 50s was one example. The internment of Japanese Americans in the 40s was one example, even though that was ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court in a case called Karamatsu versus United States. Is not there anymore. I mean, we don't do that anymore, and I don't think you could find an instance where that sort of situation would happen again, although enemy combatants is a very interesting development. I do think that there was, back, I forget which administration this was, and I'm saying Madison, but I may be wrong. Any historians around there might want to correct me. The original Alien Sedition Acts, based on the XYZ affair, for those who know your history, the Palmer raids. I mean, we can go on for those. Now, some people think that this is a march to a certain point. I think it may also be seen as kind of like an ebb and flow, maybe a pendulum or a sine wave. Certainly, we are at the bottom of that trough. We need to get back up. The question is, what will do that? And I think that there has to be an assemblage of political will in this country to do that. There has to be a very, very clear understanding by the American people what is happening. Jefferson said we are granted unalienable rights. And legally what that means, unalienable, is it cannot be transferred or destroyed. Our rights are ours. The government does not give us our rights. Jefferson tells us that our rights belong to us from the time that we're born. The government's job is to recognize and guarantee those rights. And then when the government's not doing its job, it's the government that's on the defensive, not the public. Those rights, therefore, cannot be taken away. They can only be surrendered. And we have to be very careful about what rights we're surrendering, because I do agree with you that there is a point at which we will not get back what we have surrendered. The American people need to be very, very clear about that.
Could you answer some of that question as well? Jumana Musa, could you answer some of that question?
Well, that's hard to follow up. I would tend to agree, and with the ebb and flow. I think the one thing I would say, and just coming from the perspective of Amnesty International and our recent experience with the administration, and they had a lot to say about us, we've seen what we frequently see, which is as soon as a strong criticism comes out about administration policy, they attack the voice and they ignore the criticism. I think what we were quite heartened by, and what I think will move it in having this, screened and put out there, was the fact that what we experienced as an organization was certainly some calls, and if you didn't follow it, the administration attacked us for calling Guantanamo the gulag of our times, saying that, and then we saw all the congressmen with food and lemon chicken or whatever they brought out to show that everyone's being fed well and treated really nicely down in Guantanamo. What we saw as an organization, there were, the few calls, the few crazies, a few, you guys are supporting Al-Qaeda, the typical. But the hits to our website went through the roof. More online actions taken on the issue of torture than we had seen in months. The one action we had online that you could take to call for an independent commission got more hits than usually all of our online actions get in 1 month. We had incredible sign-ups for our Denounce Torture campaign, which is meant to educate, which is meant to have public forums to educate and mobilize people on this issue. And so I think, just as in the past, what's critical here is the dissemination of information to the public. And we've heard how in so many ways that's been blocked and that's been difficult. But, of course, speaking from the perspective of not just a human rights attorney, but from a grassroots organization, I think that's the one area that can't be ignored. And I think sometimes it is the difficulty of taking some of these technical things that might be described, whether it's about the Patriot Act, whether it's about classifying and reclassifying information, whether it's about what the heck does NSEERS mean, or all these other things that can, easily get looped up into government jargon so they sound very benign, and just making those accessible and real to people. And I think you will see a political will to turn this around.
Could I just say very briefly, and I'll make it really brief, the thing that scares me the most, and I think that Americans need to be most aware of, is this allegation that the President of the United States has absolutely unbridled power at a time of war. It was said by the Fourth Circuit in the Hamdi case. The Supreme Court pulled back on that in its decision, but it was reiterated last week in the decision of the Hamdan case, with Judge Roberts of the Supreme Court nominee being one of three of a unanimous opinion. If you read that opinion, it's a brief opinion, you can easily find it online. If you follow the arguments in the Fourth Circuit, the conservative viewpoint is that the President's hands cannot be tied at a time of war. And when you go back and read your history and read about the wartime powers of a president, if you accept that premise, if the American people are going to accept that premise that we are at war and that the war is fought on every street in this country, as Judge Ludig offered to the government in the Fourth Circuit this week, then we are in real trouble, because I wonder if the next president, be it Democrat, Republican, or whatever, is going to give up those powers.
Doesn't the Constitution of the United States require that only the Congress can declare war?
Well, but what the courts say is that that was given in the war on terror. Whether that's true or not, the court says that there were congressional authorizations, and that's what they say.
Congress has the sole authority to declare war.
Thank you, Ms. Cassell. We are attending a congressional briefing on the 911 Commission report 1 year later. The full title, A Citizen's Response, Did the Commission Get It Right? Convened by Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. I wanted to acknowledge some other reporters. Barry Zwicker is here. He's a Canadian journalist. Could you stand, Mr.
Stand up, Barry,
so we can see you? Also, David Ray Griffin who wrote the New Pearl Harbor. He was here earlier. David Ray Griffin, he's here earlier. As mentioned before, Pacifica is currently streaming live to all its affiliates. And you can also go to www.pacifica.org. This briefing is also streaming on www.indiemedia.org worldwide. C-SPAN is covering the full day and will air this Saturday night, July the 23rd. Free Speech TV will also make this briefing available. DVDs of today's hearing will also be made available. And this briefing will be posted online at www.house.gov/McKinney. That's McKinney. And various other 9/11 Truth websites such as Amnesty International and others. We're going to move forward with our next panel. We want to thank the panelists who are here. A round of applause for their insight. Thank you. Next, we will hear, the topic is Intelligence Reform, Immediate Response and Recommendations. The first topic will be the new D&I, Congressional Oversight and Unbiased Intelligence. Speaking will be Mel Goodman, who is a former CIA agent analyst and currently works with the Center for International Policy and is a professor of international security at the National War College and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. Mr. Mel Goodman will be seated for the first panel. Also, Mr. Ray McGovern, who we've heard, will be also here. He's a veteran analysis director of the CIA. The both of them will be discussing congressional oversight and unbiased intelligence. We will also have a topic, The Wall, breaking down the division of intelligence, military, and law enforcement. Speaking will be David McMichaels, who is former CIA. Mr. McMichaels is an historian and former U.S. Marine officer who served as a CIA senior estimates officer at the National Intelligence Center, specializing in Western Hemisphere. He was the editor and publisher of the magazine Unclassified, which opposed the use of covert intelligence operations. Mr. McMichael is also a member of the Veterans Intelligent Professionals for Sanity. Mr. McMichaels will be speaking on The Wall, breaking down the division of intelligence, military, and law enforcement. The next topic will be covert operations and increased intelligence budget, solution or cause. Speaking will be John Nutter, Dr. John Nutter, who is a political scientist and the author of the CIA's Black Ops, Covert Action, Foreign Policy, and Democracy. He served as a faculty member at Michigan State University and Texas A&M University. He has taught courses on covert action, terrorism, guerrilla warfare, and international politics. Are all of our panel members seated? And can you please go in the order that you were mentioned? That's Mr. Goodman, Mr. McGovern, McMichaels, and Nutter. Mr. Goodman, would you like to begin? Could you turn on your mic, please?
Will be brief. This morning I argued that the 9/11 Commission was constructed basically for failures, so it should be no surprise that I also believe that the intelligence reforms were not only failures, but extremely counterproductive in any attempt to try to reform the intelligence community. And I think basically, if you look at the approach that the 9/11 Commission took to look at organizations and structures and budget and oversight, they were destined to miss the real failures, which were personal failings.
Mr. Goodman, would you suspend your talks for one moment? We need the people in the audience to please settle down. This is being aired live. Thank you very much, and we want to hear the comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman.
Thank you. The point I was trying to make is that the 9/11 Commission emphasized the wrong issues in terms of budgetary issues, oversight issues, structural problems, and organizational problems, that the real problems dealt with personal failings, bureaucratic cowardice, and the lack of any accountability. So all I really want to do is march through the 6 or 7 reforms that the Commission agreed on, try to describe what was wrong with those reforms, and then get into the 6 or 7 points that I think need to be considered as genuine intelligence reform if we're ever going to get the problem of intelligence, which now costs this country over $40 billion a year. We spend more than the entire world on intelligence matters. The first reform, obviously, was the creation of a Director of National Intelligence. I'm not going to get into the major problem of the DNI because Ray McGovern is going to discuss that from the terms of politicization of intelligence. But I just want to say that if you wanted to politicize intelligence on any sensitive issue, I can't think of a better way to do it than to place the Director of National Intelligence inside the executive branch. And I don't want to talk a lot about John Negroponte, but given his history in Nicaragua and Honduras, and the cover-ups of the rapes and the murders that took place, and we know about the cover-ups, this was certainly a poor man to turn to if you were going to try to really tell truth to power, which is the job of the Director of National Intelligence. So you've taken a step that is going to be vastly expensive and vastly disruptive, and we've already seen the kinds of problems it's created in the intelligence community. This problem is further worsened by the fact that John Negroponte is on record as saying that he believes that intelligence is a service function
and that the job of intelligence is to, quote, meet consumer demands. Well, anyone who believes that is halfway on the road to politicization. The second reform was to weaken the role of the CIA and the Director of Central Intelligence. Now, granted, the CIA has been a major problem in American national security policy for the past 30 or 40 years, and it clearly needs change. But I think we have to remember what Harry Truman kept in mind, that you do need a central intelligence agency outside the policy process, outside the political process, that can provide objective and balanced information and intelligence assessments to policymakers, and particularly to the White House and to the Congress. By weakening the CIA, you're eventually going to turn the CIA into nothing but a collection agency. That would be human intelligence, the so-called human issue. Because step by step, what we have done is gradually taken away the CIA's capabilities in signals intelligence, in order of battle and military intelligence, in satellite imagery. And the important thing about that, and I'll address this later, is that all of these issues and all of these areas have been given over lock, stock, and barrel to the Pentagon. So what you really have is the military's control of the intelligence community. If there is one institution in town that controls this $40 billion institution, it is the Pentagon. And something has to be done about that, and the 9/11 Commission didn't even touch that problem. The third reform that was addressed by the 9/11 Commission was the incentive for sharing intelligence. If the President of the United States wanted intelligence shared, all he had to do was bring in the major actors, the principals of all of these agencies, and lay it out on how intelligence should be shared, and if that isn't done, then heads should roll. This is not a hard thing to accomplish. But this has never been done because there's never been any real interest in sharing intelligence. Secret intelligence is power to the intelligence community. And the FBI has not shared its sensitive sources. NSA has not shared its sensitive intercepts. During the whole build-up to 9/11, one of the problems was they shared summaries of their communications that were intercepted, but never full-text assessments of what they intercepted. So, of course, intelligence has to be shared. All of the agencies of the intelligence community must see this intelligence. But this is something that the President could do very quickly. The next reform I want to discuss is the creation of a National Counterterrorism Center, which a lot of people feel is a useful reform. Frankly, that's a reform that worries me, because going back to what Mr. Michaels was saying earlier, and I think he's raised in looking at the characteristics of a national security state, I would add a 13th characteristic. The politicization of intelligence and using intelligence to go to war is certainly a characteristic of a national security state, and that's the 13th characteristic that we've seen. But if you take his formula and you look at the role of the Director of National Intelligence and the power he has now over FBI domestic intelligence collection, and look at the role of the National Counterterrorism Center, which has joint operational planning in the security area, we really have the kind of joint operational structure that is not far from MI5, the very intelligence institution in Britain that I think most members of Congress do not want to create in the United States. So I think one of the things that needs to be debated in this country, are we introducing an MI5 type organization into the political process and the intelligence process through the reforms of the 9/11 Commission. The fourth reform dealt with funding and public accountability. Now, this is an important reform. The Church Committee and the Pike Committee over 30 years ago called for an openly declassified figure for intelligence. In fact, to have a secret figure for intelligence violates the Constitution, in which you have to make a public accounting of funds. But this had nothing really to do with the 9/11 disaster. The important issue about funding is the amount of money being spent by the intelligence community and by the various homeland security initiatives. We have a Pentagon that is now spending over $420 billion a year. Homeland Security is spending nearly $40 billion a year. Intelligence is spending over $40 billion a year. George Bush alone has doubled the CIA budget during his time in office, and the public has no way of offering any assessment on any of these issues because a lot of these numbers are secret numbers. So it had nothing to do with 9/11, but this is a very important area, but there's no sign whatsoever that this is a reform that's being observed any other way but in the breach. Finally, another problem that the 9/11 Commission talked about that had nothing to do with 9/11 but would be important is we need to get back to a genuine oversight process. This is where the Congress has let down the people of the United States. The only way we have to get a handle on intelligence activities is through the Senate and the House Intelligence Committees. Now, the 9/11 Commission called for a joint Senate and House, a blue ribbon commission that would clearly be nonpartisan, which is what we need. The Senate would probably not allow that, and I'm not even sure the House favors it. But until we get back to a rigorous oversight process, there is no way for citizens to have a knowledgeable, informed way of offering opinions about the intelligence community. And finally, the last reform, which was totally ignored by the intelligence community and probably for the right reasons, was the idea of taking all of the paramilitary capabilities of the CIA and placing them in the Pentagon, where we would have less access to the activities of the military over the conduct of paramilitary activities. This would be an extremely a dangerous step, and I think that's why both the CIA director and the Department of and the Secretary of Defense have agreed to ignore this particular reform. Now, what kind of reform do we need? And here I'll be extremely brief. One, the 9/11 Commission centralized intelligence. That is very dangerous. We need to decentralize intelligence. You need redundancy intelligence. No one institution, no one agency, no one bureaucracy, no single analyst or individual is going to have the final answer on any of these serious intelligence problems. These intelligence issues deal with nuance, they deal with very gray areas, they deal with issues that you're never going to have complete information on, and you need as much competitive analysis as possible. What this reform has done is placed most intelligence analysis in the hands of the Director of National Intelligence inside the executive branch, and I said earlier, this is just a recipe for politicization of intelligence. So somehow we have to get back to decentralization of intelligence. We need to demilitarize intelligence. The Pentagon controls about 85 to 90% of the intelligence budget and nearly 90% of the intelligence personnel. If you look at the major collection agencies that spend most of the $40 billion, these are all Pentagon agencies. It's in their charter. They're called, quote, combat support agencies. They're controlled by Donald Rumsfeld. And even before the 9/11 Commission had done its work, Rumsfeld did a very clever thing. He created something that's never existed before, an Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. Now, that should have been vetted by the Senate Intelligence Committee, but Rumsfeld didn't go there. He went to his buddy in the Senate, John Warner from Virginia, and John Warner chopped off on that immediately. And now with that, Rumsfeld has a tool to manipulate any reform that takes place in the intelligence community. And the battle that Negroponte is going to have, if he's going to be successful, is dealing with the Pentagon and dealing with an Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence who has far more power than Negroponte, far more control over the personnel and the budget of the intelligence community. Finally, we have to get away from this idea that the only way to arrive at acceptable conclusions on intelligence and operational matters is fusion centers. The National Counterterrorism Center is a so-called fusion center. What a fusion center is to take people from the Directorate of Operations, people who work undercover, who are operationally oriented, and to mix them with analytical people, analysts, intelligence analysts, from the Directorate of Intelligence. Whenever we've had a fusion center at the CIA or in any other part of the government, you've had failure because the operations people have manipulated the analysts. One thing to keep in mind, operations is all about policy. Covert action is policy. Clandestine operations is about policy. Even the clandestine collection of intelligence is oriented towards supporting policy. It's a service unit for policymakers. It's become that way over the last 10 or 15 years. If you're going to do analysis fairly and have some kind of objective voice, you can't contaminate that process with the operational ethic and operational personnel. So if a fusion center failed at the CIA, which led to 9/11, that was the Counterterrorism Center, The immediate reform, TTIC, the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, was a failure. And now we even have a larger fusion center called the National Counterterrorism Center. These are formulas, I think, for disaster and also for politicization. Finally, I would say, even though we don't like to use any word that deals with elite or elitism in this country, we do need some kind of elite analytical cadre in this country. We need people who can think strategically. We need to be able to bring people in from the academic community or from the think tank community to write national intelligence estimates, to do strategic analysis. The CIA has gotten away from strategic analysis. They do very little of it. They're essentially a wire service service for current intelligence. That's what they do primarily. They don't do deep think pieces. And if you look at the major problems that we have around the world, our North Korean policy is a disaster. It's strategically so conceptually flawed. That is one that's going to be hard to put back on the tracks in response to a question that came up earlier. If you look at proliferation problems, these are serious strategic issues that require deep thinking and not the kind of constant seat-of-the-pants assessments they get from the various intelligence agencies and the intelligence community. All of this could have been done without creating a director of national intelligence. All you had to do was rewrite some of the executive orders because, frankly, a director of central intelligence has the power to move money around, to move personnel around, to move programs around, to mandate collection priorities. President Carter did this for Admiral Stansfield Turner when Turner became director of central intelligence and looked around as a good military man and wanted to know what his authority was. He felt it was insufficient. President Carter took care of that problem for him. The problem with people like George Tenet, who was a political hack, he wanted to serve a master. That was the slam dunk thing. Sure, Mr. President, that's a slam dunk. I can get that for you. He didn't want to do the real grueling work of the intelligence business. Now, my final word is we're not going to get the problem of terrorism right. And forget about a war on terrorism. As someone said earlier, terrorism is a tactic, and you can't conduct war against a tactic. President Roosevelt didn't declare war on the Blitzkrieg. He declared war on Germany. I don't know what this war is all about. I don't know how it could be won. It's continuous. It's global. It's now at home. It's going to be very hard to reverse. But you're not going to get any of the terrorism struggle right unless you get the intelligence right. And you're not going to get the intelligence right unless you have more foreign liaison. And I say that because the 9/11 Commission says there's too much dependence at the CIA on foreign liaison. Well, if you go back and look at all of the captives, the Al-Qaeda captives and the various terrorist captives that we've had, virtually every one has been arranged with foreign liaison. Without the help of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and even Syria, which the White House doesn't like to talk about, we would have done nothing in the world of trying to stop terrorism and to capture Al-Qaeda captives. Landing 160,000 troops in Iraq is just not going to do it. We've created a safe haven and a sanctuary for terrorism. We've created terrorism where it didn't exist before. So until we start to address these problems and start to really confront the damage that the 9/11 Commission has done to us, it's going to be very hard to get this policy back on the tracks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman. Mr. Ray McGovern.
Thank you. I guess it's been about 20 years since we worked together, Mel, and I have to tell you, I feel very like a poignant moment here. We didn't always agree on everything on substance back then, but I find myself agreeing with everything you just said, and I want to publicly associate myself with that. I also want to say that those were the best of times, and they became the worst of times. I'm sitting next to two colleagues here who are good examples to everyone because of the courage and because of the integrity they have. Mel would not abide the prostitution of intelligence. He failed to see Russians under every rock, as Bill Casey did, And he wouldn't recognize Russians under every rock. He said there were Libyans. He said there were Vietnamese. They were not all Russians. And for that, he paid a heavy price, and he quit. Not only that, but he testified very manfully, very courageously against Robert Gates, the archdeacon of institutional politicization, to try to prevent him from becoming the director of Central Intelligence. And 31 senators voted against Gates, which was unprecedented in this town. And Dave McMichael, well, he came on to work on Latin America the same day Bill Casey came on to be the director. And when he saw the charade that was happening with respect to Central America, he went down there to see what the situation was himself. And when he found out the real case, he quit and went public, including at The Hague. So I'm sitting next to two very, very courageous folks, and I feel honored to be here because I think we're all in the same business. We're all trying to spread a little truth around the way we used to do, I hate to say it, in the old days. Thanks. Let me say a word about congressional oversight, just to add to what Mel's already said. Streamlining the committees, nice idea. Given the power structures around here, probably not possible. But you have to realize what the implications of this are. Witness the John Bolton affair. Because the Senate Intelligence Committee is the conduit through which things like NSA intercepts would have to go, Roberts, supreme regime loyalist, was able to sandbag that whole process. And so however much Lugar, however much Joe Biden would beg their colleague Pat Roberts, he'd say, no, you're not cleared for this, I'm not going to show you those intercepts. And so they don't know who it was that John Bolton wanted to snoop on among his colleagues. Or think about Representative Hoekstra. Now, you know, it was his predecessor who asked for the IG report from the CIA that Mel mentioned this morning, the one which talked about CIA performance on 9/11. It was finished in June of last year, so over a year ago, and it was ready. And to his credit, Hoekstra wrote a letter and said, may we pretty please have a copy of that now? You know, the one we asked for, we understand it's finished. And they thumbed their nose at him. The White House said, no, don't give it to them. And so to this day, even though people have been named in there, even though it would be incredibly helpful to this kind of session, it's not available. So what we have is the fox in charge of the chicken coop here. What we have is a oversight in the other sense of the word. Now, why is this important? Well, think about this. Senator Roberts, Pat Roberts, Republican from Kansas, has admitted publicly that if the senators and representatives knew in October of 2002 that the intelligence was bogus, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that no ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, I say it would be very doubtful that they would have voted for this war, okay? Then he finds out particulars about the forgery. The forgery, my friends, has to do with the charade or the fable that Iran was seeking uranium in the African country of Niger. We knew that was a forgery before the war started. Representative Waxman wrote a very bitter letter to the president on the 17th of March, 2003, saying, look, we've been briefed on this intelligence. Turns out it's based on a forgery. I voted for this war based on that tale about uranium from Niger. How can this happen? Okay? Well, now we have the whole affair with Valerie Plame and Joe Wilson. We have an incredible example of White House neuralgia. What kind of a response this has been when Joe Wilson told the truth? Why was that? Well, with all this who shot John type of reportage, we forget. This had to do with the biggest lie justifying the war. What was that lie based on? It was based, my friends, on a forgery. Now, who did the forgery? Well, Jay Rockefeller, ranking member of the Democrats there on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence says, let's ask the FBI to look into that. What did Pat Roberts say? No, I don't think that would be appropriate. So the FBI is not looking into it. Now, why do you suppose everybody's so exercised about this? Because they're afraid that if you peel the layers down, if you go a little deeper, and you ask yourself, well, who did the forgery? You might find out that that forgery was made in the United States of America, folks. You might find out that that forgery was concocted or fabricated by the same folks that gave us Iran-Contra. There are a lot of our fellow alumni running around out there, not from the Intelligence Directorate, mind you, that are just pleased as punch to hire themselves on to do these kinds of things. And I think we're getting closer and closer to finding out who that is. About the new DNI, well, what can I say? Mel has said it. I would also emphasize what Mel said this morning. It's not the way you draw the lines and the diagrams. It's the people, all right? Character counts. Integrity counts. Doing your job counts. Being promoted on the basis of doing your job and telling the truth counts. Accountability, it's dropped out of the dictionaries in this town. You can't find it. Now, I served under 9 DCIs and 4 at very close remove. And I can tell you that what Mel said about Admiral Turner is exactly right. He said to the President, look, I'm supposed to be head of this whole community, and I don't have the authority. I'm a military man, and I'm very reluctant to accept responsibility without having the necessary authority. And Jimmy Carter said, no problem, I'll do an executive order for you. He did. Stan Turner was not loath to knock noses around, so if the FBI was not sharing information with him, he'd go to the Oval Office and say, Mr. President, would you please call the director of the FBI and have him share what I need, or else I can't be your principal intelligence advisor. So I've seen the system work. And more relevant to today's proceedings, I had the good fortune to be with Stan Turner, almost a year ago. Well, yeah, it was about 11 months ago, because it was about the 9/11 Commission report on the Lehrer report. And as we were waiting to go on, I said to Stan, why didn't you tell the Commission that you made the system work? And he said, oh, Ray, no, I didn't tell him. I said, well, Stan, you're no shrinking violet. Why didn't you? He said, no, Ray, you don't understand. They didn't want to talk to me. They didn't want to talk to me. Here's a very vigorous alumnus of this Director of Central Intelligence post around who made the system work, and no one, staff or members of that commission, saw fit to check with Stan Turner. It's just quite remarkable. So when I hear yesterday on the radio as I'm driving around this new head of the National Terrorist Information Center, what's it called? The NCTC? Yeah. And he's going through his confirmation proceedings, and Barbara Mikulski says, well, you know, it seems to me you all create a center. Whenever there's a problem, there's a new center. It's a center-centered environment you all live in. And he didn't handle that really well, because her following question was, well, how does this relate to the National Terrorist Center in the CIA, and how does it relate to the FBI? And he said, well, we're going to work that out. We're going to work that out. Let me come to an end. Well, what I would point out is that there are people around who have the experience to comment on these things. And sometimes they do it beside themselves. I mean, sometimes they just instinctively react. And Tom Ridge was such a person. Of all people, Tom Ridge. When he heard about this plan to have a national intelligence director sit on top of all this 15-agency bureaucracy and on top of the director of central intelligence, he said very quickly, you know, I don't think you need a czar. He told Fox News Channel, we already have one level of bureaucracy that we don't need. Now, who better to comment on that than Tom Ridge, who was given 180,000 people from 32 separate government agencies to sit on top of as a czar, okay? So he spoke truth despite himself. So did Slade Gordon. Now, someone mentioned him before. He was a member of the 9/11 Commission. And exactly a year ago, after the issuance of their report, I had been asked by BBC to go to their studios and talk on their TV. As I'm coming out, who's coming in but Slade Gordon and Jamie Gorelick? And I said hi, and Jamie went right in right into the studio. But I had a chance to talk with former Senator Gordon, and I took him aside and I said, Senator Gordon, you know that the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, already has all the authorities that it needs under the National Security Act of 1947. All he has to do is have the president back him up. He can do the job. You know what? He put his arm around me. He said, yeah, I know, but this one won't use them. Won't use those authorities. And I was just about to say, oh, and then Slade Gordon got invited into the BBC thing. I mean, what? So they're going to create a whole new superstructure because one fellow wouldn't use the authorities that were easily available to him given the necessary presidential backing. Perhaps the best comment came from Bill Odom. Now, some of you know Bill. He was about as high as you can go in the Army intelligence. He headed up Army intelligence, and then he headed up the National Security Agency. He's a PhD, Soviet specialist, or Russian specialist now, I guess. Very well respected around town. And he wrote a little op-ed in the Washington Post on August 1 of last year, just, 10 days after the release of the 9/11 report. And what he said was, no organizational design can hope to compensate for incompetent incumbents. Well, yeah, you can add sycophantic incumbents to incompetent, and that's a sad story to tell. Let me just very briefly mention that on June 23rd, 1972. Bob Haldeman and Richard Nixon are talking on tape. And what they're doing is they're talking about getting the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation of Watergate. Okay? June 23rd, did I say it was June 23rd? Okay, that's 6 days after Watergate. Okay? They're already at it. Now, as some of you will remember, they got Dick Walters, the deputy director for CIA, down there, and they told him that we can make believe McCord really still works for the CIA. We can you got to help us out here. We could finesse this thing. And so Dick Walters went back and talked to Richard Helms. Long story short, Helms says, "No, I don't think I'm going to do that." Now Helms was motivated mostly by his all-consuming determination to protect the agency. And sometimes that worked not so well for the country. But in this time, it did work well for the country. And the reason I mention this is, what would happen now? What would happen now? Where would the president go? He'd go to Negroponte. What's different about Negroponte? Well, he's got no institution to protect or defend. Negroponte's whole record is one of being an obedient bureaucrat who will carry out any policy that he's told to do, even if he decides or even if he must realize that it's not only illegal, Iran-Contra, but immoral, death squads, So you got a real problem now, folks, because you don't even have a person like Dick Helms who would place some premium on loyalty. One last thing, it wasn't only Helms. When John McCord, who was one of the three Watergate burglars, I assume too much because not all of you have hair as gray as me, John McCord was wondering what to do, and his lawyer approached him in 1973 and said, I think we can fix it so that you can